Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the committee's 8th meeting in 2020. Could I just ask everyone, or remind everyone, to put their mobile phones on silent? Could I also say that John Finney has submitted his apologies for this meeting. The first item on the agenda is a declaration of interest. Just to say we have a new committee member, Rachel Hamilton, who takes over from Jamie Green. And I'd like to formally welcome Rachel to the committee. Can I ask Rachel if you'd like to make a declaration of your interests at the start, just so the committee know where your interests are? Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. I would like to draw members to my register of interests. I have a share in a small hotel in the Scottish Borders.
Thank you. And in the same breath as welcoming Rachel, I'd like to also just pay tribute to Jamie Green, who has left the committee. I'd just like to say that Jamie has been on the committee since the start of this session and has worked, I believe, extremely hard, made my life extremely difficult sometimes by asking very long questions. He wrote me a very nice letter saying how much he'd enjoyed being on the committee, which I'm not going to read out because it's in places is as long as the questions that he's asked. But fair to say that he worked extremely hard, and I'd like to thank him on behalf of the committee for all the effort that he put in. I'd like to move on to agenda item 2, which is an inquiry into the construction and procurement of ferry vessels in Scotland. The first panel, and there will be 2, is to take evidence on our inquiry into the construction and procurement. And I would like to, before we welcome that panel, welcome Stuart Macmillan and Dean Lockhart, who are attending this item. Do either of you want to make a declaration of interest before we go into this item? Stuart.
Thank you, Convener. As I have made a declaration in the past in the Chamber, that my wife does work part-time for CalMac.
Thank you. So, moving on to welcome our panel. The panel today is from David McBrain Limited and CalMac, and I welcome to the panel Duncan Mackison, the Chief Executive Officer at David McBrain Limited, and Robbie Drummond, the Managing Director of CalMac Ferries Limited. Now, there are a series of questions, and I know you have both, well, I think you've both been to the committee before, so committee members will ask you directly the questions. Could I just ask you to keep your eye on me as well? So if you're giving a very long and detailed answer and we're running out of time, I can maybe encourage you to reduce the length of your answer. I hope that won't be the case. But Emma, the first question is from you. Emma.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to you. We've heard various evidence throughout this process about the procurement of 801 and 802, as some people say they weren't the right vessels, and we know that CMAL are responsible for vessel procurement under the tripartite arrangements in place. CalMac have been consulted extensively at technical level to achieve their endorsement of the detailed specification and designs which form part of the shipbuilding contract. And so I relate to the different evidence that we've heard that says 801 and 802 were the size of the ships we needed because of 127 vessels, cars or lorries, and 1,000 passengers. So the capacity was there that was required. But can you explain a little bit about what input did the CalMac Ferries Limited have in developing the specifications for hulls 801 and 802?
Perhaps if I talk a little bit about the process, and I'll defer to Robbie to talk about the specifics of the specifications. So, process is a standard process that relates to the development of a design and build contract for these vessels. Our involvement at the start of that process is to create an outline specification, and we then pass that on to CMAL. CMAL then start the procurement process. So that outline specification was created by us at the start of the process, and that was informed by previous discussions at the Network Strategy Group, which takes place between ourselves, CMAL and Transport Scotland. So we contributed in detail at that start point, and thereafter the procurement process takes place after that. We have some involvement in the procurement process in that we contribute individuals who are part of our team who have specific technical expertise, but they operate within that process as part, if you like, of the CMAL process. But to answer your question specifically about, if you like, the outline specification, in simple terms, as long as the vessels which are produced at the end of the day are consistent with that initial specification, we will be content to receive them. And our understanding at the moment is that that is likely to be the case. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Robbie.
I think the only point I'd make is that you touched on the size of the vessels. So that specification was set based on a broad 100-metre sized vessel, based on resilience that those vessels were able to operate. And that formed the basis of the specification that was then taken forward to meet the requirements of those routes.
And how did you engage with CMAL, Transport Scotland and the Scottish ministers in order to I guess, develop this, the process, or to make sure that what the specifications you were asking for were actually being delivered or met?
But I can answer that. So the broad specification of the vessel was set in the tripartite group, which is a tripartite between Transport Scotland, CMAL and CalMac. And it was that group that agreed the broad scale and size of the vessels. And then it was CalMac's responsibility to define the operator specification that was then provided to CMAL, who then went out to procurement.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, the next question is from Angus. Angus.
Okay, thanks, Convener, and good morning to the panel. You know, clearly there have been claims that the 801 and 802 were not the ships that CalMac wanted. So I'd be keen to explore in a wee bit more detail, and the committee would like to know how CMAL incorporated your desired specifications into the agreed basic design of the new vessels. Was everything that you stipulated taken on board?
So I can respond to that, and it's referred to in our submission. So we presented a detailed outcome specification to CMAL. CMAL then took that specification and they prepared a high-level specification with the objective of allowing the yards the ability to create some innovation around that. Yards then submitted their bids based on that high-level specification. But as we said, if those vessels come in and they meet those specifications and they are authorised by MCA and registered by class, then we'd be delighted to have these vessels in our fleet and operate them for the benefit of our communities.
Okay, thanks. With regard to the detailed design, was CalMac Ferries involved in the development of the detailed design of the vessels? And if so, can you outline how the process operated and highlight where you think problems arose?
So if I can maybe pick that one up. So as is usual, in my experience in a design and build contract process, the end user, which is us in this case, basically states in output terms what they would like those vessels to look like. The procuring authority, which in this case is CMAL, then takes that specification and turns it into a more condensed document, which is then used to go out to organisations, companies which want to tender as part of the bid process. It is then the process by which they then play back their bids to interpret that output specification. So in broad terms, at the start of that process, we set out, roughly speaking, the length, type of vessel, number of vehicles, passenger capacity, those sorts of things, and then those are developed through that process. We step back from that process once that procurement exercise has started, other than, as I said earlier, providing individuals who can provide technical expertise within the procurement function that's run by CMAL.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Convener.
Sorry, Rachel, you wanted to come in with a question.
I'll just ask you, from that basic design and that desired specification, beyond that, Mr. Drummond, you said that there was some created some innovation around that. Can you describe what that innovation looks like?
Well, it's the intention of having a high-level specification to go out to tender is the yards can then come back with their views on what the innovation might look like to meet those specifications. And then it's up to CMAL to judge which yard has produced the best tender and then to take that forward into contract.
Okay, so how do you actually judge what is a further innovation or a creative approach to looking at that what is desired beyond the basic specification? How do you judge what in terms of that tender?
So the specification is an outcome-based specification, and then yards can produce different ways of meeting that, using different ways of innovation, different technologies, different equipment, different layouts. It's then up to the body who is judging those bids to say which of those best meets the criteria in the most efficient way.
The procurement process will define, if you like, the scoring mechanism for the various different elements of the bid, and it will then score those elements based on quality and price, and the view is formed through building up the scoring of all those various different packages as to which is the most economically advantageous bid.
There's a few follow-up questions. Can I just for my clarity, I'm not sure. We were given a letter last night from CalMax solicitors, which has got a basic statement of requirements, which is a page and a half of, sorry? CMAL, sorry, solicitors. Could you just confirm, have you, it's just literally a page and a half. It says dimensions, class notifications, operating conditions. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about? Is it as simple as that, a page and a half document?
No, the specification we put in is much more detailed than that we provided to CMAL, and the specification that was in the tender document that CMAL produced was much more detailed than that document.
So that document is just an abbreviated, that
sounds as though that's a summary of key points from a more detailed document.
basic statement of requirements, it's called. So
that's not a document that we produced. So I said
that's not the document you produced. So
the
that's the
document we
document
produced is
they
very detailed,
produced.
as we said in our submission.
So okay, we must ask some more on that. Richard, you wanted to come in, and then Peter.
Yes, just a quick question. Thank you, Convener. Can I ask you, who actually was responsible to design the interior of these ships? And is the design agreed before the works? Was the design agreed before the work started? I.e., were blueprints drawn up for the ships?
Ultimately, the design is, to a large extent, the responsibility of the bidders who react to the specification which is provided in the tender documentation. When it gets to the process, you get to the preferred bidder stage, then those designs are discussed in more detail. So as we said, our responsibility is to set out, if you like, in large handfuls what the overall specification is, and then the bidders play back their specific designs. Your point around where does that sit at the moment?
Were the designs then agreed, or were the designs agreed and then changed?
So we don't have visibility of that, because thereafter it is the, if you like, the CMAL who are running that procurement process, and that interplay between CMAL and Ferguson's, that level of detail, we're not directly involved with that.
Thank you. The design and build contract, it's the responsibility between the yard and the procuring body to get those designs all agreed and approved by MCA and class.
Thank you.
Peter, followed by Colin.
Thanks, Convener. You say that you agreed the basic specification of these two ships. So did you agree that you needed 1,000 seats on these two ships?
Well, the reason the size and the scale of the vessels was agreed in the tripartite group, and that was to meet the needs of the particular routes. So the vessels for A21 and A22 have currently got a passenger capacity of 950. So the real constraints around designing ferry is to maximise the space you have got on the car deck, and that is the real constraint, and that's where the design expertise comes in. The reason 950 was selected for passengers was to meet the needs of the Ardrossan route, and that's required. But as with all CalMac ferries, we can operate those vessels with different passenger certifications. And if you operate with different passenger certifications, that means you can operate with different crewing numbers. So to give an example, the Isle of Mull has got a summer passenger certification of 951, but in the summer we operate that vessel with a requirement of 530 and a different crewing level. So having a higher passenger level offers a degree of flexibility, which means that vessel can operate across different routes, but we can vary down the passenger certification level for the right to meet the requirements of particular routes or particular seasons.
So you're saying that at some points in the yearly timetable, you require that number of seats on these two ferries, because the evidence that we heard previous is that you were never ever anywhere near 1,000 passengers on either of these two routes, and so why build a ship to that specification?
So first of all, the prime kind of design parameters is around maximising the car deck, and the difference in the passenger certification is a much smaller element of that. That level of passengers is required for the Ardrossan route at certain points in the timescale, but it made sense to build those vessels as the start of a standardised class, and then you've got the flexibility of a higher passenger number, but you can vary that down to meet the requirements of a different route that might have a lower passenger numbers, and you can reduce those crew numbers accordingly. So it gives you that flexibility.
Okay.
To follow up on the point that was made about the involvement of CalMac, so you've been very clear that you're involved at the start by setting out what your preferred design effectively is in terms of what you need, and then it's then up to CalMac. But given this is a design and build contract, there's a huge amount of design work that takes place throughout the term of that contract, or in this case, doesn't seem to be taking place in the term of that contract. But are you saying that CalMac have no role in that process going forward? It's entirely up to CML, because that seems to contradict something that evidence we heard earlier, that you were involved all the way through that process.
I think the point I would make is that we are involved as an organisation, exactly as you say at the start, in terms of defining the output specification. Thereafter, the process is managed by CMAL. We have some members of our team who are, if you like, in this context, seconded into CMAL's team to help with the assessment of the various different work packages. So they will be involved with that, and if there are specific technical questions or issues as the design develops, they can then come back to us. But it is the distinction, we are not running that process, but if you like, we have certain individuals with technical expertise who will augment the CMAL team to be part of that.
Stuart, did you want to come in on? Okay, just if I then can, the next question I'd like to ask, if I may, is Luke Van Beek, when he came to the committee, said that the previous CFL chief executive stated that ships 801 and 802 were not the ships that CalMac wanted. Is that correct? And if it is correct, why do they not want it?
So, as a statement, that's not correct. I haven't met Luke Van Beek, and I'm not aware of my predecessor having met Luke Van Beek previously. Robbie, I think you met him.
Yeah, and we've said very clearly in our statement that we welcome the ships and we want them in our fleet so we can operate them. I did meet Mr. Van Beek. We had a discussion around LNG. And while LNG
I'll come on to LNG in a minute. So we're talking about I think the overall specification of the ships, the 1,000 passenger and, if I've got this right, because it was 1,000 passengers and something like 83 cars on the lower deck, 40 on the top deck, and 16 HGVs.
We specify the vessels, so we want them. So the discussion I had with Mr. Van Beek was on some of the complexities around training and regulation for LNG and the connection with the MCA, but that was the extent of it.
Okay, we'll come on to LNG if I might. So you're saying that the specification, which is the statement of requirements basically that we've been shown, is exactly what you wanted to meet your needs across all the harbours, although the infrastructure in the harbours wasn't suitable.
Correct.
That's my question.
Yes.
So you accepted at the outset that the ships wouldn't fit into and work in some of the harbours where you were supposed to be taking them on for?
They were selected to be operated in certain harbours, and there was an understanding that at some of those harbours works would be required to enable them to fit. Okay. But there was a clear connection between the design of those vessels and the locations and routes where we intended to use them, and that's still the case.
Okay, so let's just then move on, if we may, to LNG. And again, Luke Van Beek stated that the previous CFL chief executive said that CFL didn't want LNG ships. Is that right or wrong?
Well, our specification required dual fuel, so we put that in a specification. That's what we wanted.
So you definitely wanted, for absolute clarity, LNG ships?
Yes. So that was an agreement that was reached between, the tripartite agreement, where it was agreed that to reduce emissions, LNG was the sensible choice at that time if we wanted to reduce fuel emissions. LNG is a fuel that is used widely through the Scandinavian ferry fleet, so it's a very normal technology. It's used widely in the shipping industry, and its use is going to increase into the future until alternative technologies become closer.
Okay, without meaning to take any questions that are coming later on this, I just wanted to look back at your evidence that you submitted, and I'm sorry, I'm just struggling a wee bit, where you accepted there wasn't much availability of LNG in Scotland, so you were doing it just purely, to quote your evidence, to stimulate the availability of LNG in Scotland. That was your ulterior motive for wanting LNG, was it?
That was the agreement of the group. So the real drive was to reduce environmental emissions. There's some very challenging targets in the ferry industry to reduce emissions, but it was also there to try and stimulate the use of LNG as an economic development. So that was part of a policy agreement agreed at the tripartite agreement that was the right thing to do.
So you absolutely wanted these ships in the way that they've been designed with LNG, and Luke Van Beek is wrong.
Correct.
Okay, well, that's an interesting thing. I'd like to... Peter, you want to come in?
Just a small follow-up on the LNG story. We've also been told that you can't run the ferries on LNG when you're coming in and going out of harbour. Is that correct?
That's not correct. You can run them on LNG when they come in and out of harbour. I think operationally it's more efficient to run them on MGO as a matter of operational efficiency, and that's the way we would adopt them, but that's a relatively small part of their operation.
But if it's a short route and it's only a half-hour crossing, it's not a short part of the trip. The coming in and going out is quite a big part of on a short 30-minute crossing, as some of these ships undoubtedly will be on. So my question then is it in these circumstances, is it worth the extra expense? Because for a fair part of the journey, you won't be using LNG.
Well, for the actual majority of the journey, you will be using LNG, and it's a very easy switch between MGO and LNG. So it's not a complex process to switch these to the fuels as you're moving out of harbour, and when you're full underway to move straight to using LNG. So it's a very normal and common practice to use it that way.
I think I would also make the broader point that we touched on earlier on about resilience within the fleet, especially just now because we have an ageing fleet, and therefore it's not unusual for vessels for various reasons to have to be moved from one route to another. So you have to conceive in design that some of these vessels will sometimes be used on longer routes and sometimes be used on shorter routes, but you have to take a view of what's relevant to introduce to the fleet as a whole.
And we're going to move on, but my one comment to that is, of course, if the infrastructure is in the port where you want to move them to, but if not, it doesn't work. Maureen, the next question is yours.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Can I ask about the costs?
Oh, sorry. No, sorry, I apologise. I apologise, Maureen. I'm cutting you off because I did promise I'd bring Mike in at that point. I apologise. Sorry, it's Mike.
Thank you, Convener. I'm trying to drill down to the award of the contract and as a result of the tender documentation. Now, to be fair, I'll predicate my question by reading out something that the committee received yesterday. You may not be aware of. It's a letter from CMAL's lawyers. And it's you're not aware of that. No, so I'll read it out so that you are. Basically, it says, in the evaluation of the tender documents, the names of the bidders were anonymised, quite rightly, and the 7 designs were identified as from ship A, B, C, D, E, F and G. On the day when the tenders were received and opened, CMAL and CalMac checked the tender documents for completeness, following which both CMAL and CalMac representatives reviewed the tender documents over a 2-month period in CMAL's offices. Further clarifications took another 2 months, so 4 months. It then says in the letter, gives reasons why vessels A, C, E and G were judged not to be appropriate for the contract. And it then says shipyard B was identified as a leading bid. It doesn't even mention ships D and F. So there are 3 contenders here that meet the specification. A letter on 2015 recommending Ferguson's to the Minister points out that Ferguson's bid was the most expensive bid and the highest specification, and what's more, was over budget, but what has been budgeted for. I am trying to find out why Ferguson's was chosen by CMAL and CalMac and recommended to the Minister for award of the contract when it was the highest cost and it was the greatest specification, and the other 2 were lower. Roy Pedersen, in his evidence to us, said, when I asked him that very question, why was it chosen? He said it was either incompetence, vested interest, or corruption. And I wondered whether you could give the committee the reason why Ferguson's was recommended over and above the other 2.
So, as I said earlier, so we haven't seen that document, but we would have had individuals working as part of the CML team and as part of the assessment process. CalMac or DML as an organisation was not formally involved in that assessment. It would have had people involved in the scoring mechanism.
The lawyers say you were.
contributing.
The lawyers in this letter to us say you, I'll read it again. It said, on the day when the tenders were received and opened, CMAL and CalMac checked the tender documents for completeness, following which both CMAL and CalMac representatives, CalMac, reviewed the tender documents over a 2-month period. In CMAL officers, further clarifications took another 2 months. So for 4 months, CalMac was involved in this.
If I could just build on that. So our involvement was on working with CMAL and assessing the operational impacts of those bids as to whether or not they met our specification. So that was supporting the evaluation process. We did not the responsibility of evaluating the price, the yard, whether the yard can meet that bid, the quality aspects. That's down to CMAL. Where we were supporting was whether or not those bids met our operational requirements and how we would score those in terms of meeting those specifications.
Well, CMAL, through their lawyer's letter, are obviously involving you in this, and what you're saying to us is, no, it's not us.
No, we're saying we were involved in assessing the operational
You didn't make a
specifications
recommendation.
of the bids.
You weren't involved. You're saying you weren't involved in the recommendation.
What we're saying is we would have had individuals involved in the assessment of the various different packages, and there would have been technical discussions, but thereafter they contribute up into a broader decision, and we're not involved in that broader decision.
Right. So you've just said you're not involved in the recommendation for the award of this contract.
The final recommendation has to come from CMAL, who are the procurer and the body who then awards the contract.
Oh, I understand that. But CMAL are trying to say you were involved. Their lawyer's letter fingers you.
And I think it comes down to we would have had people involved in that process, but it is at what level?
We're not getting anywhere here, are we?
Well, let's see. Richard Lyle wants to come in on the back of that. Let's see if he can.
Previously, I was a councillor, so in the council, when a contract came in, the 2 things that contended were price and quality. And basically, if the price was a bit higher, but because the quality was better, the council may accept that. Is that what happened in this case?
We don't know because we haven't got the record of that. We could take this away, Chair, and have a look at what maybe individuals said, but that, if you like, aggregation process where all the scores are taken together and you make those choices.
But you would agree that a contract could be possibly accepted because the quality was better and the price, even though it was a wee bit higher, you were getting a better quality ship.
Yes. That's our understanding of the tender. It was a judgment of price and quality, but also a judgment on the capability of the yard to produce the vessel. That would all be part of the wider assessment.
Thank you.
Mike wants to come back in. You obviously know the people involved. What level of management were they at, the people that you sent to give advice to CMAL?
They were senior employees in the company.
So Board members?
They were not board members, but they were members of, I think one was an executive member and one was a senior manager.
Ah, okay. Mike.
I know you haven't seen the lawyer's letter, but I have read out the relevant question to you, and he does finger you as actually taking part. So I just want to confirm, the evidence that you're giving to us now, you are in direct contradiction to CMA's lawyers when you are saying you are not involved in the recommendation of Ferguson's at all. So what you're saying to me, if I've got this right in the committee right, I just want to make it absolutely clear where we are, that you are saying that despite the 4 months involvement in examining the tender documents, you were not party to the recommendation to award the contract to Ferguson's.
So I think what we're saying is we would have had individuals involved in contributing to that process, but ultimately that choice is not something that we contributed to. So
you didn't have a view on the best. No, I just can't understand this. 4 months and you don't have a view on the tender document.
We did have a view. We assessed that. We provided the operational view of those different bits.
Well, what was
but the overall assessment is a matter for CMAL.
Well, what was your assessment? You're before the committee. I'm asking, what did your senior management assess after 4 months examining the tender documents? What did your senior management recommend as the best tender?
As I understand it, those individuals would have contributed to the technical assessment, but the broader appreciation of what's the best, best tender would have been done at a different level within CMAL.
It's also done at an anonymised level. So the information that the individuals were assessing was based on yard A, B, C, D or E.
Richard, you wanted to come in, did you? Were you all right?
No,
Stuart, you wanted to come in.
I have a different interpretation from that which Mr Rumbles is expressing, and I'm going to read the totality of what it says in the letter. It says, on the day the tenders were received and opened, CMAL and CalMac checked the tender documents for completeness. You'll confirm that's a technical process. Following which both CMAL and CalMac representatives reviewed the tender documents over a 2-month period in the CMAL offices. Further clarifications took a further 2 months. Is there anything in that? Is there anything in that that infers that CalMac went any further than simply doing the technical health check on the tenders? Is there any reference in that you believe is being put to the committee that you are part of the decision-making process as to who to recommend as ministers?
No, I don't think there is.
That's sufficient. Thank you, Convener.
Sorry. Maureen, I'm going to let you come in now and we'll take... No, come on.
Thank you, Convener. Can I ask about the dual fuel vessels that we're now building? Does the dual fuel necessarily cost more than the diesel-powered ships, given that you would probably have had to fit scrubbers on the diesel-powered ships, would be my...
No, so we wouldn't fit scrubbers because the saving in emissions comes from using the LNG. So it is a very straightforward matter to switch between the different fuel types. So there is no additional operational impact of using different fuels. There is an element of infrastructure that's required at the ports, but that's relatively small because it's pumping infrastructure to speed up the pumping process. So these vessels can be loaded direct from truck. If you want to speed it up, you need some infrastructure to make that faster. So there's some investment required there, but otherwise there is no increase in operational requirements.
Okay, so in actually running of the ships, there's no increase in the cost. And do you have a view on the best way to minimise the environmental impact of the new ferries? So, for example, things like the use of battery electric or hydrogen-powered vessels are also possibilities.
Yeah. So I can comment on that, and I'm Interferry, which is the body representing ferries. I'm a member of their operating policy committee, so I've got wide exposure to what's happening.
That's international.
In the international.
Yeah, yeah.
So I've got a wide exposure to chief executives of other ferry companies and what's happening internationally. And this is something that all ferry companies and all shipping companies are wrestling with. And at the time the decision was made, LNG was the only sensible choice to reduce emissions. And if you're making that decision again today, it still remains the only choice for ferries of this size and duration to be able to deliver reduced emissions. Now, if you look further to the future, battery technology is becoming better, and there's lots of vessels using that technology, but it is not yet suitable to work on larger vessels on more than a 30-minute duration. So the expectation of the industry is that battery technology will become more prevalent with larger ferries, and then you've also got the potential development of hydrogen. But these are a matter of a number of years away before that becomes real. So ferry companies sitting now have got a choice that is primarily around LNG if they're using it for larger or longer vessels.
So to be clear, in order to meet our climate change targets as a country, LNG was judged the best fuel system.
If the choice you want to reduce emissions, it is the only choice now for a vessel of that scale and operate those particular routes. We have, of course, got 3 hybrids in our fleet that work very effectively, that are diesel-electric hybrids, and they work very well, but they are smaller vessels and they operate on shorter routes. And you'll see many examples of those throughout Europe, and that's where the technology is developing. It's just not yet developed to use for vessels of this size.
Okay, thank you.
LNG is sometimes referred to as a transition fuel at the moment because of this delta, if you like, between wanting to move in that and needing to move in that direction and make those savings, but not knowing what the exact future technology is going to be. Different companies are embracing that in different ways internationally. Some companies are actually building ships now with the express ability to take out the propulsion unit that they're putting in at this stage because they're anticipating that it will change in the future to a different mode. So we are at a time of uncertainty. But at the time when these choices were made, and we still believe today, it's an entirely logical choice to step in that direction and use LNG.
But in the process of renewing an ageing fleet, this was the best option at the time.
Yeah, and I think there's possibly
And
a broader point around the fleet again, if I may, which is if we were starting with a blank sheet of paper today and designing CalMac's future fleet, you would have the luxury of being able to design in what is the best solution for groups, and you would probably end up with clutches of electric routes and those sorts of things. We are not in that position because we are moving towards it incrementally. So therefore, we have to go with solutions which give us flexibility. I think it does suggest or shine a light on, in the longer term, having a longer term strategy to replace the fleet that gives you the bandwidth to consider these options is perhaps a good thing to think about. But for the purposes of this one, where it was very specifically around 2 routes, then it's logical.
Okay, thank you.
Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Convener. I want to ask you about something where I suspect you're both perhaps spectators rather than participants, and that is simply the issue of the clear breakdown that took place of the relationship between CMAL and the supplier, Ferguson Marine. Now, I know from contracts I've been involved in the past that once you get the contract out of the drawer, you're in trouble. The relationship should be based on good day-to-day relationships. Did you see evidence of that breakdown? And if you did, how did you yourselves respond to that?
So I think I would start off by saying we ourselves have a good relationship with CMAL. I meet with the chief executive of CMAL frequently, every 2 or 3 weeks. We operate alongside each other in a world of large contracts, and there are sometimes tensions, but the relationship is sound. Clearly, we were aware of issues. You couldn't really not be, but we weren't part of the detail of the issues that were obviously taking place at the yard.
Do forgive me, that's what I would expect to hear, but my question was specifically, how did you respond to that clear emerging difficulty between the 2 key partners and you were ultimately getting vessels that you were going to operate? How did you respond to that, apart from just being a passive observer? Because I'm sure you were more than that.
Well, I think we are engaged with CMAL and speak to them over time. To state the obvious, we desperately want these vessels, and we are therefore interested in getting these vessels into our fleet as soon as possible to serve the communities. So out with the procurement process, we would have, you know, discussions and touch points around and possibly understand how things in the generalities were taking place, but we weren't involved in that specific discussion. But the point I would make is, as I say, it was very, very concerning for us to watch these delays, because we are the ones that have to live with the consequences of not having vessels and having a fleet which is lacking in resilience.
Okay. Peter, you've got the next question, Peter.
Yes. You stated in written evidence that in 2012, Transport Scotland agreed an investment plan to build 2 new vessels, one to replace MV Isle of Arran and one to replace MV Isle of Mull. So my question is, what input did you and Seamill have in the decision to build 2 large ferries? Were other options considered? Because we've often heard from the island communities themselves that they would often prefer 2 smaller vessels. It would be much more flexible, give them a better service. You could build 2 boats for less, certainly less than what these 2 are going to cost us now. So what other options were considered when you decided to go down the road of these 2 large vessels?
3 questions there. So first of all, the need for 2 large vessels was identified as part of the ferries plan. That was then built into the VRDP, the deployment plan. It was that plan that said 2 large vessels was required to meet the needs of that route, and that was agreed as part of the tripartite. So that was a process to meet the strategy that was agreed at the time, and then we went on and developed the detailed specification. I think to your broader question as to what are the right vessels to put on particular routes, I think refer back to Duncan's point around what is the largest strategy. You need to start with what is the service that you want on a particular route, and that's defined as timetable, frequency, resilience, capacity. And when you've addressed those questions as to what is the service that you want on the route, then you can look at designing the right vessels to meet that right capacity. Because different vessels will clearly have different carrying characteristics, and they will have different resilience characteristics too. So it depends what you want for the service. And then you go on and talk about what is the right vessels.
So you speak about frequency and resilience. I mean, to me, 2 smaller ships will give you better frequency and better resilience. So why was that option not taken forward? And it would have been much cheaper. We know that now. Maybe you didn't know that then, but you certainly know it now.
It was a decision made by it was to meet the strategy that was set out in the ferries plan that required 2 large vessels. I think as you go forward, it's a very good question to say what is the right vessel design, but I think that needs to be taken as part of a longer-term strategy to meet the needs of the service.
But I mean, the other thing that we've heard is that and I've already alluded to it, the island communities themselves, you consult with them, and it seems that once you've done the consultation, you basically ignore what their wishes are, and very often we've heard their wishes are for 2 smaller vessels rather than 1 large vessel. So what cognizance do you actually take of that consultation procedure, or do you just consult and then ignore it?
Well, remember, the ultimate funding decisions rest with Transport Scotland. So if I can give the example of the Ullapool route. So there was a STAG process that was run there. There was various options put there, from single vessels to 2 vessels, and it was taken the right decision based on the funding available was 1 larger vessel. I think in that respect, the communities would have preferred 2 vessels, but funding determined that the right solution was a larger vessel operating 24 hours. So funding has to be taken into account when looking at these questions.
Can I just... I think this broader point of, if I may, the need for a longer-term strategy surfaces again here. From our perspective, we are ultimately not the owners of that strategy. Of course, we have a view because we deliver the service, but our time horizon for delivering the service is limited to the contractual length that we have. So for us, being able to contribute to a longer-term debate that sets the strategy, that gives an opportunity to get into the detail of some of these questions, would be very welcome. But in the absence of that, we can have a view, but ultimately it is Transport Scotland that owns that strategy and then flows that strategy back down to us, if you like. But the context of that discussion, I think, is a good one to develop.
Wants to come in on that?
Mr Chapman said that it would be cheaper to run 2 vessels, but you're going to have, presumably, maybe not double the crew, but more or less double the crew, and you're using more fuel. So how can it be cheap? Can it be cheaper to run 2 vessels instead of 1?
I think it depends on what is the one vessel service you're going to run, what is the 2 vessel service, what are the vessels, what are the timetables, what are the hours of rest you're going to adopt. So that's driven by the timetable. So, you know, that's a complicated question. You need to address all those different parameters. So it's not one you can answer straight away.
Richard Lyle, you wanted to come in briefly.
Based on your answers, do you think we really need to sit down and develop an overall plan for Scottish ferries, Scotland's ferries? We've got different harbours, different routes, different lengths of what islands we're going to, different times, whether crews should be on board, whether crews should be offshore. We have maybe an opportunity of putting people onto the island, you know, to live in the island, their kids to go to the school in the island. Should we not now develop an overall plan? Because, yes, we do need more ferries. So, in the long term, should we not set out a better plan than what we've had?
Yes, and in fact, the Chief Executive of CMAL and I have proposed that with Transport Scotland, and we are, if you like, pushing to try and set that agenda.
Send us
and
a
open
copy,
up that debate.
please.
Say again?
Send us a copy, please.
Indeed, the committee proposed that last year when we did our inquiry into the budget, proposing a long-term plan, which I'm sure you've read. Emma, you wanted to come in briefly.
Question. My understanding is that 801 and 802 are highly manoeuvrable so that they can navigate the different harbours and I guess the Sky Triangle or whatever. So these vessels are intended to be highly manoeuvrable because of the nature of our harbours and our ports around the west coast of Scotland. Is that correct?
That is absolutely the intention. But you do raise a good point on it's not just vessels, but we also need to look at infrastructure improvements, because actually the berthing interface is the most important thing when you're thinking about the resilience of the vessels.
And our weather on the west coast might be a bit wilder sometimes as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Peter, briefly.
I just want to come in on that point, that one point. The bigger ships, they're a lot taller, they take a lot bigger hold of the wind, and they are much more difficult to dock in windy conditions than 2 smaller vessels would be. And your resilience in poor weather is decreasing. We know that. The figures tell us that. And part of the problem is these big ships, these tall ships that take a big hold of the wind, are being unable to sail, whereas 2 smaller ships, less tall, would be able to sail. So I would argue again that these are the wrong ships that you're designing right now.
Yeah, I think so. There's 2 points you raised there. So I think your point on whether different vessels were more resilient, you can design vessels to be more resilient. There's always a trade-off of different priorities. So is your priority on capacity? Is it on fuel utilisation? Is it on manoeuvrability? All those things are trade-offs, and bigger vessels will have different characteristics to smaller vessels. It doesn't mean to say they're better, they're just different depending on which of those priorities you take up.
Colin, yours the next question.
So just to be clear, though, the decision on whether it's 1 big vessel or 2 small ones, frankly, is not made by you. You don't have a significant role in that. It's made by Transport Scotland.
Correct. We can make a contribution to that as the operators, but ultimately that's where the decision is made as part of the broader strategy.
And just in terms of in your own written evidence, though, you talked about the build for, I think the quote is, the build for 801 and 802 was intended to be the start of a standardised approach. So you obviously have a view. To what extent can these vessels that are effectively a one-off be a standardised approach?
So in the, as part of the tripartite, it was agreed that those vessels would be the start of a class of vessels that will be standardised around a design. But of course, with any class, the first vessel is always going to be a new design, but then the second and third and fourth vessels you build would match that design. So that would be common in any process, that the first vessel has got to be of a new design. But I think I go back to nothing on these vessels is new or innovative. It's using standard technology that is used throughout the world, and all you're doing is bringing that technology together into a design.
Okay. So the designs that we are seeing at the moment develop slowly for 801 and 802 will be effectively a standard format we will see in the next 2 or 3 vessels being produced?
That would be a matter for the plan we talked about, but when it was discussed back in 2014, which remember is now 6 or 7 years ago, that was the intention that that would form part of a standardised design. That view that was now 6 or 7 years old needs to get taken forward in the context of what is the long-term strategy and long-term plan that we talked about earlier.
It does seem a perfectly logical proposition that we're seeing at the moment. Does the ship effectively, or ships effectively being designed on a day-to-day basis, and the concern is that then that will be cast aside and we'll have another new different design going forward. So a standardised approach is certainly very desirable, because frankly, although routes will vary, the conditions don't massively vary from one route to another. So why has that standardised approach not happened before these 2 vessels? I mean, why are we constantly reinventing the wheel every single time a new vessel is being built?
So my view is that goes back to this ability to take a longer term view. If you look at our fleet of 33, you could stand back and go, well, we should have some large ones, some medium-sized ones, and some small ones in very general terms. But you need to take that view when you've got a fleet of that size over a long period of time to be able to move towards that standardisation. So what I am suggesting is, similar to one of my previous answers, is that taking that longer-term view and the ability to look beyond, have a, if you like, an asset replacement plan that is the same sort of length of time as the age of some of these vessels. So maybe a 20 to 25-year plan, and then be able to slot in and think about replacements, would be able to do that.
What's the barrier to that having not happened before? I mean, why are we talking about this? Why has it not happened before? Why is that standardised approach and that not happened? What's the barrier to that at the moment? Apart from, you've obviously indicated that you guys are not round the table when it comes to that. Your job is purely to deliver a service during the short-term contract you're awarded, which to me seems a weakness. But so what is the other barriers to that strategy not being delivered, apart from the people that are actually running the ferry on a day-to-day basis not being round the table when it comes to developing these things?
I think it's difficult for us to comment. You know, we operate the vessels, and we have to operate the vessels that we are provided with, and we make the absolute best we can. But I talk to chief executives of other ferry companies, and they are looking at their fleets on a 25, 30-year view, and they're designing their fleets as to where we want these to be in 30 years' time. And your points about class are very well made, because not only is it much more efficient to procure classes of vessels, because clearly the design's been done, so the second, and third, and fourth vessels are much cheaper, but it's far more efficient for an operator to be able to operate those same vessels, because we've got commonality of equipment, we've got commonality of safety equipment, we can, the crews are able to operate in different vessels, so it's much more efficient for us to operate common classes.
Is the tripartite structure, which we know that the legal reasons behind it, is that a barrier? You said you speak to other operators who will effectively procure their ferries direct. They want to run it, but you don't have that luxury because of the tripartite.
Certainly, for me, you could make the current model work. The bit that you need to sit alongside that model is the long-term view, because that long-term view enables you to start lining up vessel replacement and take a strategic approach to it. So I think you could make the current model work, but it requires that longer-term position. And it's perhaps making choices around asset replacement on a shorter-term horizon that's led to some of the challenges that are there at the moment.
Angus, you wanted to come in with some questions.
Thanks, Convener. If I could expand on one of the points that Richard Lyle raised earlier. We know that historically the greater passenger accommodation on vessels has necessitated a larger crew due to safety requirements, and this greater passenger accommodation necessitates the crew to live on board, which in turn requires significant crew accommodation. So why do crew live on board the larger vessels operated by CalMac? And I ask because the committee's heard that statements that this is an archaic arrangement for island ferries, and in particular, if you cross the North Sea and look at the situation in Norway, where crews live at home rather than on board. It's a curious situation, perhaps, that we have here, although I'm aware that I'm perhaps comparing apples with oranges between the situation in Norway and the situation in Scotland.
So I'll tackle that. So first of all, for our small vessels, which is 19 of our 33 fleet, the crews do live locally, so they live on shore. For larger vessels, 19 vessels. So our larger vessels and the medium ones, so that's 14, the crews live on board. And the reasons for that is one of resilience, that our vessels operate across different routes. And if you have a crew living on a home port, that vessel has to be sure that it's going to be able to return to that home port. So in the event of any technical resilience or weather resilience, you would reduce that overall kind of resilience across the wider network, because that vessel would not be able to support other islands or other routes, because it would have to return home so that the crew could get back to their accommodation. So it's done for the purposes of wider resilience. I think you also then need to look at recruitment. You would have to assume that you'd be able to recruit qualified, and these are highly qualified mariners, at a local location within commuting distance of a home port, and that would be significantly challenging. Now, I'm giving an example. You talked about Norway. I'm in discussion with a large ferry business who is looking at changing their 25-year strategy from an onshore strategy to actually live on board strategy, because they are struggling to recruit crews who can live locally and get on the vessel. So there's a kind of wider network resilience point, and then there's also ability to recruit point. And that's why that model has been in place.
Okay, I get that. It was just good to have that on record. But we're also looking at the situation with the passenger to vehicle ratio, which you mentioned earlier. So, you know, basically, why do ferries used on the Clyde and the Hebrides routes have a higher passenger to vehicle ratio than similar international operators? And does that not result in a need for higher ongoing subsidies?
So, if I can address that, I think I covered it earlier on that the major constraint around passenger ferries is the car deck, and you want to maximise that car deck usage. Increasing passenger accommodation doesn't affect the material cost, and in any case, all of our ferries operate on a flexible passenger justification basis. So while the vessel may be able to accommodate 950 passengers, and that would require a certain number of crew, we will operate that vessel differently depending on the route and depending on the season, and we'll operate at much lower levels, which requires a lower level of crew and then clearly a lower level of subsidy. And I gave the example of the Isle of Mull, which has in the summer operates a certification level 951. In the summer we operate at a certification of 530. But you have got that flexibility to meet that vessel and go on different routes and can provide the peak capacity required during those summer months.
Okay, thanks.
The next question is from Rachel. Rachel.
You mentioned in your evidence examples of the Scandinavian shipping fleet using LNG, and you've also talked about a standardised design around the world. I just wondered how you keep informed of best practice of service provision using international examples across the world.
So we're members of a number of international bodies. Robbie's already mentioned Interferry, which is the organisation that brings together internationally all the operators of major ferry services. And we've been an active member of that organisation for many years. Robbie and I both attend their events, as do members of our senior team. So we have ongoing relationships through bodies like that in terms of what's taking place. And below our level in the organisation, at the kind of functional and technical expert level, we have a whole range of different people that sit on different technical boards and groups that discuss various different subjects which are of industry interest. So those are the sorts of organisations with which we engage. So the example, for example, which Robbie gave there of another ferry operator, that happens to be one in Canada. That's the kind of information that we'll get from being involved in those sorts of groups.
Okay. Did you use any of those learnings that you took away from that engagement from across groups across the world with regards to ferry provision? Did you use any of that those learnings in replicating that in the ferry provision in the West?
Yeah, we bear those things in mind. You know, we have a team that looks forward for best practice and has to create solutions. So those things are borne in mind to the extent that we're involved in making some of these choices on assets.
Okay, so what can you give me some examples of that?
Well, I think some of our vessels, for example, Robbie mentioned some of our hybrid vessels, they're now well settled into the fleet already, but we have many examples where other organisations come to us to understand how we've learned to operate those sorts of vessels, because that's viewed as best practice. And similarly, in other areas, for example, to do with health and safety or professional standards, those sorts of things, we will often go and be part of groups where we will bring best practice and ideas back into how we operate within the fleet.
We're involved in a number of European projects with other partners that are really pushing the boundaries of where innovation might sit. And actually in CAR, we have done a number of things that are very innovative, using around bridge management, use of data, that the rest of the ferry industry is actually picking up as examples. So we go actually outside ferry industry. We're looking at some of the examples in the airline industry as to how they operate safely and what sort of tools and techniques they use. So we're looking broadly, not just on vessel design, but then actually how you again operate those vessels and how you do that in the most efficient and effective way.
Okay, does that take into account sort of the technology around using hydrogen as well, and other, you know, innovative forms of environmentally?
I say we are connected into ferry. We're connected into ship acts. We regularly attend the forums, and at those meetings that go over 2-3 days, there's presentations from operators, from ports, but also from suppliers who are supplying the technology that goes into those designs, and they're kind of looking right towards the future. In fact, both Duncan and I have taken part and been part of those expert panels and giving evidence and talking around the future.
Okay. What would you say that other countries have taken away from your best practice?
I think we've introduced a number of things which I mentioned. So we've got best practice on bridge management in particular. There's some best practice on how we manage our crews. We've introduced new ways of managing fatigue. It has been looked at by the MCA and other bodies. So there's a number of things we've done that are genuinely innovative, a number of which have been pulled from the airline industry, which we're now presenting back to the ferry companies to say, look, this is something that you might want to adopt.
Okay. Moving on, convener. The committee has heard calls for a rethink and the type of vessels used on the Clyde and Hebrides routes, which would allow for more frequency and flexible routes. I just wondered if you've got any response to how you could better meet the needs of the community, and what is your views on these suggestions and any barriers in delivery that you might foresee?
So we undertake a significant amount of community engagement, which operates at a number of different levels, and we hold a number of our board meetings out on islands. So the context I would want to describe is one where we actively engage with communities. That is not always a straightforward exercise, but I would describe it as courteous and professional and friendly, and actually we share the, I think, same aims in trying to work towards a good service and a functioning service, and that relationship works well. So in that context, we listen and understand much of what communities require, and we're aware of the variety of views and opinions, and we welcome those in. I think what I would say is what we should really be trying to do in totality is using that information and that input and perhaps focusing that now into some kind of strategic planning exercise that develops a longer term view so that all these various factors can be seen to have been considered and then choices and decisions made on the back of that.
How often do you engage with the communities?
Well, in terms of numbers, do you want to...
I think last year we engaged in hundreds of local community meetings. So each local community has a ferry committee, and those ferry committees meet on a either monthly or twice monthly basis, or every 2 months. So we attend all of those different ferry committees, and there's a multiples of them across the region. We also engage in the ferry stakeholder groups, and there's 3 ferry stakeholder groups. They meet twice a year, so we attend those. But we also go out and meet out with those formal structures that are set in place for the communities to be able to feed back their views to us. We also go and talk to stakeholders all the time about how they feel about the service they're getting, what their views on CalMac are, and what we can do to improve the service. So we listen very intently about what we can do to change that.
Just bring Angus in, and if you've got a further question, Rachel, I'll come back to you, but briefly. Angus.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Just on the consultation with communities, I think we heard it was from Angus Campbell when he was giving evidence here a few weeks ago, that the communities in the Outer Hebrides in particular are fatigued with consultations with CalMac and sometimes feel that they're never listened to. And you have to have perhaps some sympathy with that, considering what you stated earlier about the 2 ferries on the Stornoway-Allapore route that were requested by the local community, but Transport Scotland eventually overruled that, and they ended up with the larger Loch Seaforth. So surely you can understand why people will now be reluctant to engage, given they didn't have their way, for want of a better term, with regard to the Loch Seaforth and the Allapore-Stornoway route.
If I can pick up on what I think Angus was saying, I think his reference to fatigue, and there's 2 different levels of consultation. So there's a consultation that we do at a local level, which is about timetables, about service, about customers, and what we can do to improve that. And that's an active engagement through the ferry committees and the ferry stakeholder groups. The consultation Angus was referring to was the STAG process, which is a formal process that is run through Transport Scotland to look at different infrastructure options or different vessel options. And I think that's where the community is perhaps showing some degrees of frustration with how that's progressing.
But of course, the communities don't always differentiate between a STAG appraisal and a general consultation.
Yeah, and I think I'm picking up your point. It wasn't a CalMac consultation on what the future of the ferries should look like. That's a Transport Scotland-led exercise.
Okay. Rachel, did you have a follow-up, or were you?
I will actually just mention one point, which there was evidence from Roy Pedersen and Alf Baird, along with a number of others from the island community groups. And one of their points, which is quite interesting, is that compared to international averages, the ratio of passenger to vehicle carrying capacity is considered quite high. And I wondered if you were using comparisons like you're talking about best practice with international examples, why that might be, why that ratio is so high.
The ratios are set to meet the needs of the route, and I think I've already said that we move. There's a danger that people look at what the vessel can carry. Just because the vessel can carry a certain number of passengers, that is not necessarily the ratio which we operate. We operate at different ratios depending on the needs of the route or the needs of the season, and we will vary that down to meet the needs of the route, and that clearly then has an impact on the crewing requirements. So remember, a lot of these decisions were taken in the past. I think, as Duncan said, our fleet now is averaging 23 years old, 8 vessels are over 30, so you have to look at what is the strategy going forwards and what are the needs of those routes going forward, then you might make different decisions, and that would be part of that overall assessment to say, well, what is the real need going forward, and that might lead you to a different view on what those ratios should be.
And just to confirm, the community's voice would absolutely be heard within that future discussion. I know you're talking about consultations.
So absolutely, the community should be a key part of the consultation on what that future service design should look like.
Okay.
Yeah.
You almost fell foul on your first committee meeting of looking away when you slipped in another question. But we're going to move on to Peter with the next question, and then some questions from Stuart.
Yeah, gentlemen, the 2 new ferries will require significant upgrades to port infrastructure. So, do you reckon that's good value for money, firstly? And how could the requirement for such port upgrades be avoided when procuring future vessels?
A lot of our ports and port infrastructure requires upgrading. The specific infrastructure that relates to the routes that we're talking about here needs attention. So money is having to be spent all the time. So I think that the question is this a significant addition? And that has to be taken in the round. There are some upgrades that are going to be required, but these destinations, these harbours, require significant investment anyway. And the understanding here for these vessels has always been that those upgrades are going to have to be taking place, and they're being planned already, and CMAL are responsible for upgrading those facilities. So the element of that which is LNG in terms of operating cost is a relatively modest increase, and just creating a new capacity which would take place as part of the redevelopment of those facilities anyway.
But to go back to my previous point, if you had invested in smaller ships, that infrastructure that exists would be quite suitable.
I think the point is that when you're looking at the overall investment, you're absolutely right. You need to look at the whole life costs, and those whole life costs would include infrastructure and the cost of operating that vessel across a longer period. I think, as Duncan said, whether you would have needed the whole level of investment is up for debate. Our port infrastructure requires investment.
So just to clarify, that 30 million that's been spent on the infrastructure for these two ferries, is that right, or have I got that figure wrong?
I think that's a question that you should probably put to Transport Scotland. It's broadly in that ballpark. I haven't got the exact figure.
Thank you. Stuart.
Thank you, Convener. One of the things is that you are required under the contract to get your vessels from CMAL, although there is an exception that relates to David McBrain in the Guruk Dunoon, where you acquire your own vessels. How do you assess the relative merits of being tied into a vessel fleet that comes from a single supplier and being able to go to the market and source vessels yourself?
So, the model in the shipping industry is that you tend to have an asset owner and an operator, and therefore that's a standard relationship. I think, if I'm frank, we would be fairly agnostic about where our vessels come from. We could operate them from different locations, the model from different providers, if you wish. The model that exists at the moment was the model that was created, I think, back in 2006, when there was seen to be a need to create an asset owner so that you didn't end up with stranded assets belonging to Scottish ministers. But in general terms, we could accept vessels from other, lease them from other owners on different routes. There would be a degree of complexity around that because of CMAL's role in relation to infrastructure, but at a level of principle that could work.
Certainly in the rail industry, where there's a number of suppliers, I'm not sure it's a good advert for multiple suppliers. But would you welcome the flexibility of, on your core fleet, being able to distance yourself from the problem of the stranded assets that are owned by Scottish ministers, and having greater flexibility? Would, in practice, that make any real difference? Or is it the fact that the vessels that simply CMAL own are the vessels that were designed and are suitable, age apart, for the routes that you operate?
Well, I think the point I would make on that question is that at the point at which that decision was made in 2006, the vessels, the assets, still had a significant lifetime ahead of them. For the majority, that's no longer the case. So you could arguably look at a different model. I think the requirements of operating on the West Coast in terms of weather, sea conditions, and also draft suggest that there's a logic in pulling these things together under one entity from which you lease. But you could look at other options, yes.
And finally, a slightly different subject, which is, in a sense, I guess, not really for you, but one of the options that has been discussed for some years is having the contract broken into smaller parts, which other operators could bid for. Now, clearly, you are an operator who's won the bid, so you'll have a view in relation to what you're doing. But would you have a view as to whether smaller lots would be advantageous to public policy and provision of ferry services to our communities?
So I can answer that. So that was a question that was addressed 5 years ago, and at the time the policy determined that you could break into smaller lots, but that would impact resilience through the network. So if you had a smaller lot that would only have a certain number of vessels attached to it, and you would not therefore have resilience for those vessels to operate across wider routes in event of technical or weather disruption. I think it would also be more expensive, because clearly operating 5 or 6 or however many different lots is going to be more expensive than operating one, because you'd have multiple asset management teams, you'd have multiple head office teams, you'd have multiple safety teams. So in our view, it would be more expensive and less efficient, but it's a policy decision, and either way, we would make sure we wanted to operate those vessels.
Very briefly, Richard, and very
Really,
briefly.
it really
then
comes into
Angus,
that, and I'll
if
be
you
thinking, how long does your present contract end? And are you saying you can't plan ahead because your contract doesn't extend to a length of time that you require? And we're now out the EU, so can we just say, let's give it to you?
That
And
would be
that's
fine,
been
thank you.
Loud comment. I'm not sure that's a question.
No,
If I can answer the factual point. We have got a 6-year contract that ends in 2 years. So
you can't plan 20 odd years ahead because you don't know you're going to be the bidder.
we can plan 2 years ahead at the moment. There's a
Yeah.
potential for a 2-year
Yeah.
extension, but this goes back to a very short-term contracts. And there's other
Yeah.
models in the industry where you have much longer contracts, perhaps up to 25, 30 years, where the operator can take genuine planning.
Park
Thank
that
you.
one there, because that's operation rather than procurement. So, Angus, you want to come in briefly, and then I want to come to Stuart and then Dean.
I'll keep this very brief, as it may be a question for CMAL, but can you enlighten us as to why it's proved impossible to get a replacement vessel on lease to stand by for any breakdowns, because it has had a significant impact on services in the last...
So I mean, you can ask him, but I can answer that, and that's because of the peculiarities of the routes we operate. It's primarily due to the draft requirements. So our vessels have to operate with very shallow drafts, and those ferries are just simply not available on the open market. And both us and CMAL have been scouring the market for 6 or 7 years, and nothing has emerged which meet the requirements of MCA and UK flag, and also the very shallow draft requirements.
Okay, thank you.
Stuart, you can get away with a couple of questions.
Thank you, Convener. Just the first one, you mentioned earlier on regarding the 3 hybrid vessels, and it kind of goes back to the question regarding a standardised approach. Those 3 vessels, are they the same?
Yes, it's 3 standard vessels of the same class, and they operate very effectively for us.
Right. So the standardised approach, it's not this isn't a new thing that CMAL and CalMac are undertaking. It already has happened.
That's correct.
And my final question, Convener, is just regarding the Ferguson's. When you found out, when you made aware that Ferguson's were the company that was awarded the contract to build the ships, did you have any concerns about that?
I think we, simply put, would trust the procurement process to make sure that it can make the correct decisions, that it can weigh up the evidence in the respective bids, and we would support the decision of that process. Our view out with that would be subjective rather than, and we have to rely in that process being able to come up with the correct answer and ask the right questions.
Because Ferguson's clearly, Ferguson clearly have built a number of ships for the fleet and have a vast amount of experience of building vessels for the fleet. Yeah. So you didn't have any concerns that Ferguson's could actually undertake this work?
I think I'll refer back to the conversation earlier on about our role in the procurement. Our role was to assess the quality of the bids going forward, the responsibility of assessing the quality of the yards, their financial standing, and whether or not they could build the vessels would be one for the procurer, which is CMAL, to make those assessments.
Okay, thank you.
Stuart, you were very brief. If you want to follow that one up, I'm very happy to, but are you all right with that?
Okay, yeah, that's fine, thank you. So in terms of the work that Ferguson's had undertaken for the fleet in the past, the quality of the work that had been undertaken, have you had any issues regarding the quality of that work in the past?
No, the vessels that we have, which were built by Ferguson's, are still in service and they operate satisfactorily.
I think if we refer to recent history, which is the 3 hybrids, say they operate very effectively. I know the crews like operating them, and certainly they provide a good service for our customers, and they have proved very reliable.
Okay, so the workmanship from the yard and the vessels that they have built has been satisfactory to CalMac?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Dean.
A couple of follow-up questions, if I may. First is in terms of existing capacity. Given the delays to vessels 801 and 802, Can you let us know what your existing capacity is in terms of vessel capacity to meet existing demand? And in terms of having to use older vessels which are subject to outage, and in terms of your capacity over the next 2 or 3 years?
So I can perhaps respond to that, and some of it's contained in our submission. And over the last 5 years, our demands have grown by 37%, so the volumes we're carrying are 37% bigger, and some routes that's actually grown higher than that. In the summer, our fleet is 100% deployed. There is no spare vessels. There's no space in the timetable to operate any additional sailings, and we're operating to the maximum hours of rest. And the same applies in the winter when we have to go through a whole overhaul process. So there's no spare capacity at all in the network to operate new sailings or new vessels. And that's what we have to operate, and we'll have to operate that over the next few years. And as we're aware, there is significant capacity constraints on particular routes that is causing a challenge for our communities, but also a challenge for us. And I think 801, 802 was designed so that it would actually address some of those capacity issues, because it would also allow us to do a cascade through the fleet. So it wasn't just a benefit for those 2 routes, it would have benefited other routes because we would have cascaded those vessels down and produced more capacity across for other islands. So it is a significant concern for us that we share with our communities.
And am I right in saying that one knock-on effect is that you're having to rely on older ferries, which are subject to more outage and which are unreliable?
Yes, and these ferries are already getting towards the end of their service life, if not beyond. And what that means is, for example, your supply chain of repairs or parts is often requiring you to bring in equipment which is no longer in supply. So you have to go abroad to bring in or have spares made specifically for the age of vessels that you have. So there are significant ramifications in terms of maintaining them as they get older, and things get harder all the time as they get older on maintenance.
If I can just build, the challenge of obsolescence is real. So it's not just that the vessels are older, they are more likely to break down, but as the parts are obsolete, those parts are not available. So the lead time in getting them built and constructed and brought back to us can increases any outages as well.
Just final question on this one. How would you characterise where you are in terms of capacity? You're saying it's 100%. Are you now at a critical stage where you might not be able to meet further demand? And if not, when do you think you will get to that critical stage?
That's a difficult question to answer. When I said about maximum capacity, that's the vessel's maximum deployed, so we're deployed. There is capacity on all of our routes, but not at the peak times. So the particular challenges around particular sailings and on particular seasons. And that is challenging.
Okay. Thank you. Convener, if I may ask one follow-up question.
Yes, briefly, and I'm afraid that means that Rachel will lose hers, but
just going back to something you said earlier in evidence, you said that there was no new technology involved in the design and construction of the vessels, that technology had been used elsewhere. If that's the case, very briefly, why have things gone so badly wrong in the design and construction of the 2 vessels, if it's not new technology?
Well, in our view, it is standard technology. So there's something obviously happened. We don't have direct sight of those discussions between CMAL and Ferguson's, but something has obviously happened which has delayed the production of those vessels.
very briefly, if you'd like to come in.
Technical question. Is there a difference between a design change and a modification? And how many design changes were made? And if a design change is different to a modification, therefore, how many modifications were made?
Those are elements of the contract management of the construction of the vessels. We're not involved in that process. That interface is between CMAL and Ferguson's in terms of the nature of the transactions of changes.
Okay, just very quickly, I've got a couple of questions just for clarity. The letters from the solicitors for CMAL are actually on the website, but just for clarity, so I understand this, there's a proposed billing schedule for both ferries attached to the first one that was given to us. Can you confirm if you have any feedback in assessing the milestones, or was that purely done by CMAL?
That was purely done by CMAL.
Okay. The next question then goes on to the letter that Mr. Rumbles referred to, and the process of making the bids anonymous, i.e. you didn't know which ships had been bid for by which shipyard. I'm struggling with this in my brain because if I go out and buy something as a businessman, I like to know the whole process. I like to know that the person can deliver the project that they're doing, and you know, just saying a supplier has promised you this gives me some concern. So if I said to you that two of the bidders had already built, other bidders had already built ferries for you, one of them had built the Seaforth, the other one had built the Finlaggan, the Argyll and the Bute. One of the other shipyards had built, its latest ferry was 290 cars, 130 metres in length, 1,500 passengers. The other one, a little bit bigger boats, 5,000 passengers, but they've got history of producing recently ferries. Would that have affected your view at all, or are you still happy that it was the blind process was the best way of selecting a contractor to build the boat?
Well, I think, can I refer back to, so our role in the process was to do an objective assessment as to the quality of the bids that were submitted and did they meet the specifications. And it's a fairly normal procurement process to anonymise that, so you're doing an objective view as the quality of the bids. When you then looked at the assessment on the financial security of the yard, could they build a vessel, their track record, then that would be a matter when clearly you need to identify who those were, but that would be a matter for CMAL to make those assessments on the capabilities of the yard. We were viewing purely on the specifications and whether they met our requirements.
Okay, so you are happy as the eventual operator of the boat to purely look at the paper that was produced on the production of that boat, not the capabilities of the person who was building that boat or the yard that was building that boat. You think that's entirely right and proper?
We are comfortable to go with a vessel which meets the specification that we started with at the start of the process, and we trust the procurement process to take into account those broader factors which at a technical level those people that we had involved in that process would not have been privy to, those broader considerations. Within a procurement there will be a series of packages which are being assessed, and different people are involved in different elements of those packages, and therefore there's a relatively small number of people that, if you like, see across the whole span and make those broader choices. So we have to be comfortable that the system is capable of making those choices and taking those factors into account.
So you are happy to rely on others to make that choice?
Yes.
Sorry, Mike, you want to come in and then I'm afraid...
As a follow-up to that very question, again, the lawyer's letter makes it clear that 4 of the 7 bids were ruled out. So you would have been involved in that process because of the technicality not meeting the tender. So could you just confirm for me that CalMac was involved in that decision to remove the 4 from the tender, so the top 3 that did meet the specifications, which your argument did go through, and you were part of that process? So 3 went through at that point when you would then be finished with it.
I think we need to see that letter, please, and then respond to that specifically, because it is I think we've described our position in terms of the technical.
It has been read out 3 times to you, twice by me and once by Stuart Stevenson.
And what I would say to you, because I understand the point that it was only put on, I think, the website, our website, either late last night or early this morning. We only got it late last night. So by all means, have a look at that letter, and if you want to make a comment. But the one regarding the payment schedule, I would say, has been up there for some time.
Could they let us know? Would they write to us with that?
Yes, I mean, I'm encouraging you to respond in writing to those comments. Thank you very much for coming this morning and giving evidence. And I'm briefly going to suspend the meeting to allow the panel to change over. Committee members, if you could be back by 11:10. 11:10, please. Okay, I'd like to now reconvene the committee meeting. We're on agenda item 2, and this is our second panel. And I'd like to welcome anyone back who's viewing this, and I'd like to welcome Transport Scotland. Fran Pacitti, is that right? Have I got that right? Good. Director of Aviation, Maritime Freight and Canals, and Chris Wilcott, the head of the Ferries Unit. And the first question today is going to come from Stuart Stevenson. Stuart.
Thank you very much. I want to ask a few questions about relationships, but just in doing so, I want to make clear what I'm not asking, because others, in particular Mr Rumbles, will ask about things related to due diligence. So that's an issue I'm not seeking to ask about. And in particular, really just if concisely, please, you could describe the way in which the relationship between Transport Scotland, CMAL and Caledonian Ferries Limited operate, because we've got policymakers, we've got infrastructure owners and augmenters, and we've the people who actually deliver the service. And if we've formed any view so far, we kind of, I think that's quite a complex arrangement. It's your opportunity to tell us this is simple, straightforward and natural, or otherwise.
So as concisely as I possibly can, the three parties in the tripartite relationship, I think it's important to emphasise at the outset, share a common objective, which is serving the communities who rely upon our lifeline ferry services, and that underpins everything that we do. Within the tripartite relationship, there are multiple interests which are engaged. So there are shareholder interests, creditor interests under voted loans, contractual interests in relation to the ferry operating contracts, general policy perspectives, procurement roles within that. To keep this as focused and as brief as I can, I think your interest relates to vessel procurement specifically. And within that context, we have clearly defined and distinct roles. So Transport Scotland is responsible for setting the overall policy context for ferries delivery in Scotland, and that's done through, at the moment, the Ferries Plan, which sets out outcomes, the Vessel Replacement and Deployment Plan, the VRDP, which is intended to provide that framework of investment decisions and infrastructure priorities going forward. Within the context of vessel design and procurement, CalMac Ferries Limited is responsible for providing its statement of operator requirements, and CMAL is responsible for taking those policy guidelines, the operator requirements, and developing those into a high-level tender design requirement that goes out to the market. CMAL is responsible for running the procurement process in its entirety, and CMAL manages the contracts. Once CMAL takes ownership of the vessels, it then charters those vessels to, at the moment, CalMac as the current contractor in terms of the Clyde and Hebrides contract.
Right. One of the things you said in that answer was you referred to shareholder interests. And while CMAL and CFL and indeed David McBrain are public companies registered under the Companies Act, etc., etc., nonetheless, all the shares ultimately are the Scottish Government's shares. And it would be normal, would it not, that directors very often will represent the shareholders' interests because they serve at the discretion and invitation of the shareholder. So therefore, you would expect there to be a communication between the shareholder and the directors and ultimately the policies of these companies. And that's regardless. You made reference to fiduciary duty, but that's simply relating to the implementation and operating within the Articles of Association that the companies have, which are at the gift of the board and motions that they might make to change or not change it. Is that all a fair representation?
Yes, I think my team is structured so that each of the kind of myriad interests that we have are managed separately. So as a shareholder, there is an assessor function. The function of the assessor is to look at the kind of corporate arrangements that are in place, looking at the governance processes that are there, so looking at publication of corporate plans, public appointments to the board, considering whether shareholder interests are being represented at board discussions. That's quite distinct from the kind of project role that we have, the engagement that we have as a tripartite with both CFL and David McBrain in relation, and CMAL in relation to vessel design and delivery. So the kind of shareholder interest and the project roles are deliberately kept distinct, and we wouldn't rely upon our understanding of what was happening at a board level, for example, to know what was happening on a project-specific basis.
But nonetheless, it would be impossible for the board of CMAL, as a procuring body, to progress a design which would bankrupt the company. So therefore, the money that's available from the government and the investment that's made in CMAL in their balance sheet is something that influences the design. That's a fair comment to make again, isn't it?
Correct. So we're interested in the financial management of CMAL. The way in which new vessels are funded is by way of a voted loan arrangement from Transport Scotland on behalf of Scottish ministers to CMAL. So new vessels typically wouldn't be funded from CMAL's balance sheet. I am aware of examples of that having happened, but in the case of 801 and 802 specifically, those vessels were funded by way of voted loan from Transport Scotland to CMAL.
So whose asset do they become?
They become CMAL's asset.
Right, so they're voted loan. Right, okay. More substantially, to what extent did Transport Scotland have input to and influence the design, the parameters of the design, and indeed review the bids in relation to design? I'm talking about a technical process here rather than a management process.
So two separate questions in there. The first is how did we influence the design, and the second is what input did we have to the bids. Firstly,
the review of the bids.
The review of the bids. In terms of the influence of the design, we set the overall policy context. So through VRDP, we would have identified the need for 2 large vessels rather than smaller vessels, for example. Beyond that, we rely upon the Statement of Operator requirements and CMAL's expertise as a procuring authority to refine the design. It's done collaboratively. That's done as part of a discussion. There are distinct responsibilities, but there is an opportunity for us to come together through the Network Strategy Group, so that there is a point of constructive challenge, just to kind of test the parameters, talk that through rather than the work happening in isolation. But our responsibility is to set the policy context, CFL to provide the operating requirements, and for CMAL to then finalise that tender specification that goes out to the market.
This is probably my final point, because others will develop this. In particular, we've just had CFL and David McBrain talk about the dual fuel decisions and seek to persuade us that this is becoming standard in the industry. Was that something that they came to as a result of a policy input from Transport Scotland that related to the government's view on climate change and indeed other factors?
So our policy steer in relation to propulsion, or in relation to new vessels, that they ought to be safe, reliable, other factors. We are interested, of course, in fuel efficiency and in relation to emissions reduction. We didn't specify LNG, we didn't specify dual fuel. Those came out of CFL's operators' requirements. We are comfortable with that choice, though. We do understand the rationale for them. We endorse the view that this is a well-established technology. It is a transition fuel, and in the context of our climate change reductions, continuing to use marine diesel is as a status quo just isn't an option.
Before we move on to the next question, just because I'm a little bit confused here, the basic statement of requirements that was attached, I don't know if you probably haven't seen the letter on, you have seen the letter, great. So the basic statement of requirements, you would have approved that. You would have agreed with that.
Yes.
Okay, so my question, I'm struggling to understand that there were 7 designs put forward for the ferries. 3 are rejected because they didn't meet the design parameters. Would that not worry you that 3 people had submitted a bid that didn't meet your bid requirements? Well, why would they do that?
So I can't answer that. Transport Scotland has no role in evaluating tender returns. We haven't been cited in the tender returns.
Okay, so let me ask it a different way around. How many contracts have you been involved with where the bidders have submitted tenders to do something that you haven't asked them to do, to the extent of 50% of those that tendered are trying to make something you don't want?
So I took confidence actually in the assurances that we were provided from CMAL coming out of that procurement process, where that they had received compliant bids from the market. There were a sufficient number of bidders returning positively with their concept designs in response to their high-level tender design requirement to see that that could be delivered.
So, okay, 50% of yards hadn't submitted compliant bids. That seems to worry me. It doesn't worry you.
I would like to look at this later again in detail. We've seen it very briefly. My understanding had been that 6 of the yards had returned 6 bids, which indicated that their concept design could meet the specification set out in the tender requirement. I don't know the basis on which, because I haven't looked at this in detail, I haven't had an opportunity to, I don't know the basis on which this is now identifying that only 3 of them submitted compliant bids.
It would be helpful if you could clarify that, because the letter seems to indicate to me that 50% of the yards had produced bids that weren't compliant with the original specification. But maybe you could enlighten me later. Rachel, I think yours is the next question.
Back to Stuart's original question, which was about the roles and responsibilities of Transport Scotland. Did Transport Scotland, I understand that you are there to set the overall policy and framework in context, but however, did you have an overall, or do you have a role or a responsibility for an overall oversight of the project? So, and also, did you ever think that perhaps CMAL should have had a presence at the yard?
So we do have oversight throughout the process from the point of vessel design to vessel delivery. We will be involved in that. There are structures through the Network Strategy Group meeting, which is a meeting of the tripartite parties to come together regularly to discuss progress against our programme of asset investments across Scotland. So 801 and 802 has been a regular and recurring feature of discussions at those meetings. So we do have that oversight throughout the project. We are not a contracting party, so it's for CMAL to manage its contract with Ferguson's as the client. We have engaged with CMAL throughout the contract process to monitor how that's going and to have confidence that they are acting as a responsible client in that context.
Okay.
Sorry, if I can just come in on that. I think the second question was about CMAL having a presence in the yard as well, which they do have a team based in the yard.
Right, okay. I just want to ask you about the Scottish Government documents relating to the procurement which were released about the delivery of the 2 ferries. And Jim McCall said that he believed that some parts of those documents were actually missing. So I just wanted to get your opinion on whether you believe that was correct, and if so, when the missing documents will be published, and whether Scottish Government's selective in what they had actually published.
So we are of course aware of the significant public interest in this and took the view that in the interest of transparency we would proactively release the key documents that inform people in the key decision making throughout this process. It's not a comprehensive set of documents. We have made redactions which reflect our legal obligations in relation to data protection, legal privilege, commercial confidentiality. I don't know which documents Mr McCall thinks have been omitted, but in my view we have published a comprehensive set of information that allows people to understand what the key decisions have been at each stage.
Okay.
Maureen, you wanted to come in on that.
Just on that then, if Mr McCall thinks that there are documents that are missing, is there any reason why he shouldn't or couldn't publish them in his large dossier that he gave us?
Not that I'm aware of. It's difficult to answer that fully because I'm speculating as to which documents he feels may have been omitted. We are subject, of course, to freedom of information. There is no intention here to avoid transparency or to withhold information. I don't know which documents he feels have been missing. We have sought to be transparent. We have sought to do that proactively and feel that it's a comprehensive set of information.
If that, I understand the reasons that you redacted some of the document. Are you able to answer if 100% of those procurement documents were published with redactions?
I wouldn't expect 100% of the procurement documents to have been redacted because that's not information that's held by Scottish Government. So the information that's been published have been Scottish Government and Transport Scotland documents. And Transport Scotland wasn't a party to the procurement exercise. We didn't have access, for example, to the bid submissions that were received.
Okay, maybe we'll move on to the next question, which is from me. You have seen the legal letters. You've just said that. At the back of the first one, there was a proposed billing schedule for 801 and 802 as they became known. What role did Transport Scotland have in paying off the stage payments? Did you sign them off?
In paying the stage payments?
Well, did you sign off the stage payments?
So,
because I mean, there's 48.5 million pounds, which is paid when certain milestones are met. Say, for example, cutting of steel, 4.8 million pounds is paid. Did you sign that off?
So Transport Scotland isn't a party to the contract. We won't have signed off on individual payments under the contract, nor did we inform the milestone payment schedule. We did have sight of the milestone payment schedule at the point of contract award, and that was in the context of our interest as the voted loan provider to CMAL to fund the vessels. We were given sight of the milestone schedule not to scrutinise those or to offer any approval of them. That was really done for our interest to understand the cash flow profile in terms of the voted loan payments.
Okay, but the voted loan is completely different to the payment schedule for the work as they reached, as they progressed along the thing. So, for example, 5% of the contract was paid when the order was placed. I mean, I'm trying to find out who signed off that payment. Did Transport Scotland sign it off? If they didn't, do you know when each payment was made? And if so, can you release that information to the committee, please?
So the payments are made from CMAL directly to Ferguson's. We are not a contracting party, so we have no role in signing off individual payments. We were aware of the schedule because the payments to CMAL correlate to payments from Transport Scotland to CMAL under the loan, but we're not directly signing off on those contract payments. That's for CMAL.
Okay, so, sorry, a good answer. You know exactly when the payments were made. You weren't party to the contracts. Can you give us a list of what payments have been made against the payment schedule and when they, and dates that they were made, please?
Yes.
Thank you. The next question, therefore, is from Mike. Mike.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, according to the letter, the lawyer's letter from CMAL's lawyers, according to that, only 3 of the 7 bids satisfied the tender. We've got that. So my question really is, of those 3 that satisfied the tender, what, if any, due diligence did Transport Scotland carry out on the Ferguson Marine bid for the construction of the 2 ferries? And did you carry out similar due diligence for the other 2 yards, which also satisfied the tender? So what I'm trying to find out is it your role to do due diligence on these 3 yards, or is that not your responsibility, and is it CMA's responsibility?
So Transport Scotland has no role in the procurement process. We didn't assess any of the bids that were received. The procurement was run entirely by CMAL as the procuring authority. And if I can expand upon that, because I can see that doesn't appear to be a satisfactory answer for you.
Only frowning because I'm trying to understand that if you're lending somebody money, that you don't do any due diligence to the person you're lending the money to and where it's going. So it would be very helpful.
So procurement is one of CMAL's core functions. In terms of the financial memorandum that set out its purpose, that is one of the functions that it performs on behalf of Scottish ministers. They are an experienced and competent procurement authority. They are subject to their own independent audit. They are subject to the same SPFM considerations as Transport Scotland would be. So there is no requirement for us to second-guess the substantive judgments that CMAL makes in relation to its procurement exercises. We don't routinely check or look over CMAL's shoulder when it is running procurement exercises, but in this particular context, I am comfortable that the procurement exercise was run competently, and the reason that I can say that is that in 2018, we actually asked the Scottish Government's Procurement Directorate to do an independent health check of the procurement process that had been undertaken. They did that at arm's length without any kind of influence, and they came back to say that they were comfortable that the process had been robust, that there were no kind of material issues in the process. So I'm satisfied that CMAL is the correct procuring authority in general and specifically in this case.
But at the time, we're talking about 2015, before that took place, Transport Scotland were quite happy to sign the cheques to CMAL on the understanding that it was CMAL's role and not your role.
Yes.
Phew, right. I've got some further questions later on to ask.
Okay,
if I
thank
may.
you. Richard Lyle, you've got some questions.
I'm basically what you're saying, you need to buy an item, but you get a, sorry to use this word, you need to get a middleman to buy that item for you, and you don't know what happens from the time you ask the person to buy the item until you get it. But you pay the money. Yes?
So I wouldn't describe CMAL as a middleman. CMAL...
sorry, that's only a terminology.
No, I appreciate that.
If I was wanting Emma to go and buy me a computer, you know, so basically that's what I'm trying to say. So anyway, we'll get away from that. Somebody doesn't like the way I said it, but anyway.
So CMAL...
I mean, push the question. I mean...
Yeah, what we can't understand is, with the greatest respect, you're basically saying you wanted a ferry, you got somebody to go and buy a ferry, but you didn't know what happened from the time that you asked them to go and buy it. That's what you're saying.
So we asked CMAL to procure the vessel on our behalf because that is CMAL's principal function as a wholly owned...
Yeah. So it's nothing to do with you, it's CMAL.
Well, we do have distinct areas of responsibility, and I don't wish that to sound as though I am abdicating responsibility for the project, but we do have distinct functions within that process.
Well, that's the way it's coming out. Right, OK, so what oversight, that question was born out of the answer you gave to one of my colleagues. What oversight did Transport Scotland have of the due diligence carried out by CMAL in assessing the bids received to build the new ferries? How did you satisfy yourself that CMAL was carrying out rigorous assessments of the ability of the bidder to deliver the bids? And, again, I want to part this one, did the price and quality play a part in the contract being awarded to Ferguson?
So those are substantive judgments properly for CMAL as the procuring authority. Transport Scotland didn't have a role in the procurement process.
OK, based on what you've just told me, based on the agreed tender specs, was Ferguson or CMAL responsible to design the interior of the ship or ships? To your knowledge, has CMAL constantly changed the design requirements? That's what's being suggested.
I'm aware that that's a suggestion. So my understanding of the various stages in the design process are that CMAL will produce a tender-level design, a high-level design specification that it puts out to the market, which is informed by the tripartite discussions. So Transport Scotland's policy input, CalMac's operational requirements, and CMAL finalises that design requirement.
Is that on specification, but not a drawing?
So when So when that goes out, it can include general arrangement drawings, but when it goes out, it's a high-level tender specification. In responding to that, in responding to the ITT, bidding contractors will put forward their concept design, and that is what CMAL will look at to satisfy itself that that high-level tender specification is capable of delivery. Post-contract award, there is then an iterative process of changing that concept design, which is compliant with the high-level tender specification, from a kind of basic design which looks broadly. CMAL will be, forgive me, I'm not purporting to have any expertise in naval architecture here. CMAL will be able to provide greater detail. But the basic design broadly looks at the hull form and the machinery within it. That's developed through an iterative process with Flag, Class and CMAL as the client under the contract to produce a final detailed design. You've asked whether or not the accusation that there were multiple changes made is correct. And again, I think I would like to take that in two parts. So Transport Scotland was closely involved in monitoring performance of the contract throughout the process. In relation to, so both categories have changed to the high-level tender specification, which is what will be attached to this letter from yesterday evening, are governed by change control processes under the contract. There are quite clear change control mechanisms there. And equally, that design iteration process from the basic design to the detailed design is also governed by clear contractual provisions under the contract. So throughout the process, throughout the duration of this contract, when we were aware of difficulties by Ferguson's in performing under the contract, we were keen to understand the nature of Ferguson's suggestion that there had been a number of changes requested. We obtained evidence from CMAL of a number of changes to that kind of specification, that first high-level specification. I don't have the exact figures to hand. There were of a range between maybe 80 and 100 changes of that character.
By CMAL?
By CMAL and Ferguson's. I think the ratio was about 40% of those came from CMAL, 60% came from Ferguson's. But the total quantum of those, the value of those, was about £1.5 million, to keep that in context.
Okay, my last question.
To answer that fully, I mean, separately, we are less clear around the changes that arose through the iterative design process. Our role in that was not to second-guess that design process, but to make sure that throughout that CMAL was acting as a responsible client. So we engaged with CMAL to ensure that where, for example, changes were put forward, that those were approved timiously. We received assurances from CMAL that that was being done. We engaged with CMAL to ensure that where changes were arising as a consequence of work having been undertaken by Ferguson's in advance of approvals, that CMAL was being flexible where it was appropriate for it to be flexible and not adopting an intransigent approach. So there's not absolute clarity around the number of changes.
Other people are going to ask you questions about that in a minute. But basically, I'm led to believe, or we're led to believe, that an assessor is appointed by Scottish ministers who can attend but not vote at any meeting of the CMAL board. Who is or who was the assessor? How do they report back to Scottish ministers? And and what has been their role in scrutinising the delivery of any new ferries?
So the assessor is a member of my team.
Please don't name them.
I won't. Who attends the board. The role of the assessor is in relation to kind of governance arrangements around our shareholding in CMAL. So, as I'd mentioned earlier, looking at compliance with accounting processes, public appointments process, publication of the corporate plan. It's around the kind of governance. The assessor has no direct role in relation to project-specific matters, so they would have had no direct role in relation to monitoring progress on 801 and 802. That was done through separate channels.
Yeah, but your assessor surely knew there was something wrong here.
Yes.
And how soon did they come back to you and say there's something wrong here?
So the assessor, my team regrettably is not so big that the assessor doesn't have contact or awareness of what's happening in other areas of the team. So the assessor would have been aware going into meetings from the project updates already about progress on the vessels and issues associated with them. That is not information that would have been used to anyone at the boards that were attended at the board meetings.
Yeah, I think it's worth asking, and you kind of touched on one of your earlier questions as well, as there are conditions in the voted loan arrangement that require us to get regular updates from CMAL, both in written form, which we agreed with them would be the submissions to the Network Strategy Group, which I think we've published all of those on the website. We also have CMAL Transport Scotland liaison meetings on more broad and general issues, of which this was very much a focus, and of course specific meetings on particularly delays around 801, 802. So those issues were well versed and rehearsed between ourselves and CMAL and understood at all levels.
Just last, a wee quick one. Based on what you've experienced in the last couple of years, do you think you should be changing the way that we procure ferries?
Short answer, if you would like it to be a short answer.
A yes or no?
I think that there is always room for improvement, and we should be open to constructive challenge around that. But I am satisfied that the procurement process for 801 and 802 was robust.
Frank, can I just ask a question? If the assessor is a member of your team, presumably they come back to you and say, roughly, this all was hunky-dory and fine, and therefore you feed that back up the chain.
Yes.
Who do you feed that to?
We report directly to ministers to give them project updates.
So you would have told the minister if you were concerned or your assessor was concerned on the way the board was interreacting?
Yes, but I think, again, specifically in relation to 801 and 802, we would have been aware of progress independently of the role of the assessor.
Were those written reports?
A combination of written reports and just regular updates.
Are those available to the committee?
I think some have already been. I think they've already been proactively published on our website.
Might not see them through the black lines.
Okay.
Okay. Next question is from Colin.
Convener, the committee has obviously heard about the breakdown in the relationship between CML and Ferguson's Marine, and clearly the impact this has had on the project. What did Transport Scotland do to try to repair this relationship and keep those projects on track?
So, undoubtedly, a breakdown in the relationship between the contracting parties. If I may, I would resist the temptation to categorise the breakdown in relationship as the cause of delays. I think it's more a symptom of it. What did we do? So initially, we did receive regular updates from CMAL on progress. That was a condition of the voted loan. Initially, CMAL indicated some concern, some slippage to the programme, and initially we were confident that the mitigation that CMAL had in place to manage those was adequate. That's described in the Network Strategy Group updates that have been published on our website. The mitigation included regular escalation meetings with the contractor and its own on-site monitoring. Around February 2017, CMAL wrote to us indicating that at that point it had concerns that the delays to delivery were beyond those that would be permissible under the contract. And at that point, they wrote directly to ministers on that occasion. At that point, we convened a meeting of the parties to understand what the underlying issues were. I think those are well rehearsed, but I can go into those if that's helpful. Transport Scotland sought to bring the parties together to incentivise them to work constructively, and in that context we were not acting as an extrajudicial dispute resolution mechanism or decision maker, but just seeking to encourage the parties to work constructively in their client-contractor relationship. Both parties had obtained independent advice in relation to the cause of delays, and we encouraged them to share that advice with one another. They did, but there was no reconciled view on the cause or proposals to move matters forward. I'd indicated to Mr Lyle that we sought assurances from CMAL that it was acting as a responsible client to the extent that it could, exercising flexibility in relation to its approvals, ensuring that approvals through that iterative design process were happening timiously. We also saw no evidence from Ferguson's at that point of them engaging the contract mechanisms that existed in the event that that wasn't happening. We encouraged CMAL to look at what flexibility it had in relation to milestones under the contract, just to encourage or safeguard as a responsible client to the extent that it could to assist with Ferguson's cash flow issues. And that was undertaken in, sorry to be vague, summer 2017-ish, I can confirm the date for that, where there was a revised milestone payment schedule tied to clear performance delivery mechanisms to assist with Ferguson's cash flow. We were unable to accede to all of Ferguson's requests in that respect, but I am satisfied that CMAL did what it could, achieving the right balance between flexibility and risk. We encouraged the parties to look at, sorry, this is not a concise answer, we encouraged the parties to look at alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. Those are clearly set out in the contract. So there's the option for mediation. Parties couldn't agree on an appropriate mediator or the process to be applied there. There is a process for expert determination. CMAL, in that view, CMAL took the view that the quantum of the claim, which at that point was around £66 million, exceeded that which would be appropriate for reference to expert determination. I think that was a reasonable view. I know that it was informed by their own independent legal advice. So we encouraged, or encouraged is the wrong word, but we were clear that the next stage then, if there was a contract dispute, would be through the contractual mechanisms in the Court of Session. That wasn't forthcoming from Ferguson's as the contractor. In the absence, what else did we do? In the absence of a formal dispute resolution mechanism, we sought to shift the focus from what had gone wrong to what let's take a more forward-looking approach. How do we get this back on track? Are there reasonable steps that we can take to ensure that we are bringing this back on programme, minimising delay? We engaged Commodore Luke Van Beek, had been engaged in the context of voted loan arrangements, a commercial loan to Ferguson's, independently of us. We sought his input, whether he had any feedback. He made some proposals, none of which were appropriate to take forward. But that was useful in satisfying ourselves that we had done everything that we could to really incentivise and facilitate Ferguson's performance under this contract. Sorry, that wasn't a brief answer.
No, interesting answer. Colin.
It was, but I mean, there was lots of encouraging going on, but given the catastrophic failure we're dealing with here, is encouragement enough? Is there not a more, given this is now hundreds of millions of pounds worth of taxpayers' money going on trying to resolve this? Well, first of all, were you, knowing what we know now in terms of the turnaround work that's taking place, were you satisfied that the scale of failure here you were aware of because of reports from CML? And do you think that there is a need for a more direct intervention when it comes to contracts such as this, given that this is taxpayers' money that's being used instead of just encouraging?
So we didn't have perfect knowledge at the point throughout this process. We were relying on information from CMAL and equally relying on contradictory evidence from Ferguson's. And in those circumstances where there is a contract dispute and there is a legitimate claim, we would expect the contractor to bring that through judicial processes, and that didn't happen.
But in terms of the information you were getting from CML, knowing what we know now about the turnaround work, was that information comprehensive, and did it reveal the scale of the problems that we know about now?
Yes, I think that CMAL has been consistent in its view about the cause of delay. The information that it provided, it would have been, with the benefit of hindsight, I think that we can now see clearly that CMAL has been correct in its reporting to us. We weren't second guessing that at the time, but we were in receipt of contradictory information. And I think very challenging for CMAL to have presented evidence to prove a negative, where it was saying, well, look, we haven't been requesting changes, and in the absence of a clear change control mechanism at the yard, very difficult for CMAL to evidence what it had not been doing.
And in terms of the mediation, it just seems remarkable that that didn't take place because people couldn't agree who did it.
But there's a clear contract provision for that, and that would have had to have been undertaken in terms of the contract. And we're not an extrajudicial decision maker there, so we couldn't have forced that issue. That was the contracting parties.
Is that a flaw in the contract?
I think it's a standard BIMCO contract. It's used internationally. It's also a standard ADR contract that you would see in commercial contracts of any nature, so there's always scope for refinement. But I think that the ADR provisions in the contract of themselves were probably adequate.
Emma, briefly, you wanted to come in. Did you on this?
Yeah, it's just to pick up about the conflict resolution, and I guess to add, in our evidence, Alec Logan mentioned on January 22nd issues around morale of the workforce. And we've got the dossier from Ferguson's Marine that basically says CMAL prevented any negotiated resolution by refusing to engage. It prevented any normal dispute resolution process to resolve the impasse by refusing to agree. And then Luke Van Beek's from Official Report, when he presented, he used the words adversarial and basically said that he knew the relationship had broken down. And so, and then in Michelle Rennie's presentation, when she came, she basically said that when she started in the summer, it was widely known that the relationship between CMAL and female had broken down, and that was not a particular secret. And once that emerged, ministers in Transport Scotland sought to engage constructively to get the two parties to engage constructively. So it seems that there's perceptions of it might be, say, he said, she said, one person saying one thing, one person saying another. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the fact that they seem to be opposing statements.
Is very much the challenge that we have experienced throughout this, is where we have received opposing feedback and opposing information, and trying to navigate a constructive way forward through that. I can't second guess Mr Logan's experience on the yard. I wouldn't wish to do that. I would agree that it is clear that, and well understood, that there had been a breakdown in relationship. For me, reference to that being an adversarial relationship or otherwise, I think detracts from the fact that these are two very competent and experienced commercial actors. There were underlying commercial tensions here. It's not about a breakdown in relationship.
And when we visited the Ferguson's, was it a couple of Mondays ago now, it seemed that relationships have improved, that there's better attitude, people are more objective. It looks like there is a turnaround. So would you agree with that?
So we, within Transport Scotland, yes, that's our understanding. I've also been down to the yard. I've engaged directly with Tim here just to understand what progress on the vessel is going to be. But we are deliberately trying to stay in the kind of client space and thinking about CMAL's interest under the contract, and others within Scottish Government are more closely cited on the detail of the turnaround programme at Ferguson's.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Peter, you wanted a question, followed then by...
Yeah, up until last night, the committee had no idea who the other bidders were. We now know the names of the other bidders that were unsuccessful, which is useful. But there's no money attached to these bids. We've no idea who bid the cheapest bid, for instance. We know that the dearest bid was female, and that was the bid that you accepted. But it would be very useful for the committee to know the costs attached to the three bids that were deemed to be satisfactory. In other words, they met the specification. So can you enlighten the committee on the price of these bids?
Well, so that would be an issue for CMAL. I suspect there would be commercial confidentiality now, I guess, even with the passage of time about releasing that information. But that's something CMAL would have to consider in as owners of that information.
So you don't You don't have that information?
Not as far as I'm aware, we wouldn't have received that information.
Obviously, CML would have that information. I'm going to go a wee bit off track just for a second. Some of the other information we've had is that at least one of these ships, probably 802, because it's furthest from completion, would be best to be scrapped and start again. Have you any thoughts on whether that's a correct way forward or not?
So I think from a Transport Scotland perspective, I mean, we've looked at this all the way through when we're looking at all the options going forward around these difficulties. I think you heard from CalMac earlier, their real need to get the vessels on the network. If we consider the options of scrapping and starting again, that would effectively be going back to square one in terms of a procurement process, which would take at least 12 months or so. Again, CMAL will be able to outline this in greater detail, but you would be talking a number of years delay in getting vessels into the network and into service. So from our perspective, that's not an option that we would count as considering, and given the impact it would have on bringing a new vessel into the fleet.
I mean, is Fran any thoughts on that?
So I would endorse that. We have looked very carefully at a number of options on how best to proceed here. Ministers' clear objectives have been around securing an outcome which works for delivering the vessels, the jobs and the yard. From a very narrow Transport Scotland perspective, our priority is to get these vessels into service as quickly as we can because of the need and the demonstrable need of the communities who are waiting to receive them. Scrapping either of the vessels and starting again wouldn't deliver that as quickly as we need to happen.
Are you sure that's correct? Because having seen 802, it's a long way from being completed, and we have heard evidence that you could scrap and just build a standard vessel, you know, of a design that's proven and has been built many times before, just as quickly as you could finish 802 for sure.
So for start,
you can answer that very quickly, Fran, because I'm then going to drag Peter back on track and move on to Maureen.
So yes, I am sure.
Okay.
Thank you. Well, the next question is from the Deputy Convener, Maureen Watt. Maureen.
Thank you, Convener. When the contract was awarded to CMAL, Ferguson's had just recently been bought out of administration. Was there kind of extra due diligence, if you like, in terms of the financial and managerial capabilities, I suppose, to still deliver on the quality and price that was already agreed, because it was effectively, I suppose, a new company?
Yeah, so again, without wanting to labour the point, this would have been CMAL that undertook that level of assessment, not only on this bid, but all of the bids. So we're confident they would have undertaken those assessments at that time, and that those assessments would have demonstrated and given them confidence that the company and its ownership structure at the time would have been able to deliver.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, then the next question, therefore, is from Mike Rumbles. Mike.
Convener. Mr Wilcock, you're head of the Transport Scotland Ferries Unit. So the letter on the 20th, I don't know if this precedes you in post or whether you were head at the time, but the 20th of August 2015 letter that we've got on from the Scottish Government about the vessel replacement and procurement of the two new vessels. Was your letter or your predecessor's letter?
That certainly precedes me, yes.
Yeah, okay. But you'll be aware of the letter.
Indeed.
Yeah. In it says, recommendation, and this is a letter to, it says, in the absence of the Minister for Transport and Islands on leave, this is to the Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure and Investment in Cities. And it says, recommendation, we recommend that you approve the award of the two shipbuilding contracts by CMAL to Ferguson Marine Engineering Limited. But we've just heard, we'll give evidence from Transport Scotland that you had nothing to do with the procurement process, that it's not your business, it's entirely CMAL's business. As I say, nothing to do with you. So why are you recommending the Scottish Government approves the contract?
So absolutely, the detailed procurement process would have been undertaken by CMAL, who would have passed a recommendation to Transport Scotland to inform ministers. So that would be the basis of that
So you're just
submission
as a
there.
post box, really. You don't have any influence over
I
this?
wouldn't categorise it as a post-box exercise. We work closely with CMAL in preparing that advice to ministers.
But you've just said we have nothing to do with the procurement process, and that I'm trying to get to the bottom of why Ferguson was awarded this contract. We're told 4 of the bids didn't meet the procurement requirement. Okay, fair enough, if that's the case. But there are 3 companies, 3 yards involved in this, and I'm trying to find out why the most expensive bid, the highest specification bid, the most expensive bid, was accepted, and who recommended to ministers that they approve it. And we have a letter from your predecessor doing just that. So I'm trying to square how a letter from the head of the ferries unit could possibly recommend Ferguson's to the minister for approval if you say you had nothing to do with the procurement service, you had nothing to do with the ensuring that the procurement service was right, you had nothing to do with due diligence. So how could you possibly recommend Ferguson's to the minister?
So, I mean, just back to the point around this being the most expensive, it was a quality and price exercise which was undertaken, so not necessarily that the lowest price would be awarded. CMAL is a Scottish Government-owned company who are charged, tasked and responsible and capable of undertaking that exercise. They would pass that recommendation back to us, and we would share that with ministers.
So you would post it on to the minister? It'd be a post box?
I would not agree with that characterisation.
But what
we would also
is your job then? What do you do?
So we would also at that point look at the available resources. We would be engaging with CMAL around issues such as the stage payments, the cash flow, whether or not this.
So you have done due diligence?
In relation to making sure that the cash flow and cost that came back was affordable.
But you've just said you weren't responsible for due diligence.
On the analysis of the bids, that was for CMAL.
Right, I'm still confused.
Well, when Mr. Lau comes to his question, it may clarify it.
Right, final
gently.
point. I put this to other witnesses. I've still not had anybody. I'm trying to give people an opportunity to counteract the evidence we got from Roy Pedersen. When I asked him specifically, why do you think Ferguson's Marine were awarded the contract? And he said it was either incompetence, vested interest, or corruption. I asked Mr. McCall that, and he wouldn't answer. He said that's not for him. I've asked others this morning, and they didn't answer the question. I'm asking you, could you comment on it, Mr. Pedersen?
I would like to address that in as unequivocal a manner as I am able, that I strongly resist that description of the process. I appreciate your concern around the ambiguity of who takes decision-making, who the decision-makers are, from some of the language that has been used in this submission dated the 20th of August. But to be clear, CMAL is the procuring authority. Transport Scotland does not second-guess the substantive judgments that are made by CMAL. That is one of CMAL's core functions and purposes. There is nothing to be gained from the duplication of effort there. We are comfortable that CMAL undertakes that process rigorously. We, in this instance, had undertaken an independent, or asked for an independent kind of health check of that procurement process, and were satisfied that that was the case. I do strenuously refute Mr. Pedersen's, Mr. Pedersen's description of the procurement process.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, can I just ask? I'm now totally confused. Just timescales. I love following dates because they give me a clue. Is that in Adelson Shaw's letter saying that the contract the costs have been agreed, they are held as undelivered. A document that was delivered to them at 10:58 on the 28th of August 2015. Which was the actual pricing of the contract. But you were writing to the Scottish ministers on the 20th of August recommending a contract when you hadn't got the final offer on pricing from the contractor? I'm totally confused. How do you do that?
I don't see. So this is the letter dated
Well, this
the 3rd
is the
of
letter
March.
for Adelson, I don't know if I'm pronouncing their name, AG, the solicitors, dated the 24th of February, said that the proposed billing schedule, which is presumed the tender document, was delivered to them on the 28th of August 2015 at 10:58, and it's date stamped at the bottom. But you've written, or Transport Scotland have written on the 20th of August, saying that you agreed the procurement of the vessels, but you don't have the payment schedule or the final price that is in the letter that wasn't delivered to the solicitor till 8 days later. I'm sorry, I want to understand the process.
I'm sorry, I don't have the letter of the 24th of February before me, but I understand.
You said you'd read it though, had you
So
not?
I have the letter of the 3rd of March.
Oh, right, okay, the later one, okay.
Okay.
Okay, so you can look at that and you can explain perhaps just a quick answer to me or the committee on how you can approve a contract before the price has actually been delivered.
So my understanding is that the contract price had been agreed. That formed part of the bid that came in, and that had been agreed at the point at which we wrote to Scottish ministers to make a recommendation on the award of the contract. And that's described in paragraph 2 here, where we're explaining that the purpose of seeking an urgent approval is to allow us to issue the Alcatel or the standstill letters to the preferred bidder.
Well, you need to have a look, sorry, with the greatest respect to that letter. Sorry, Mike, very briefly, because I'd like to come on to Richard.
Pick up this point, because I genuinely trying to focus down on actually whose responsibility it was at first to recommend Ferguson. So I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but as I understand it, just correct me if I'm wrong, as I understand it, the procurement process has proceeded. It is, CalMac said it wasn't their responsibility. They said, so you're saying it's not your responsibility. So is there a responsibility, clearly CMAL's responsibility, to make the recommendations for Ferguson's to the ferries unit, and then the ferries unit just passes that on to the minister? Is that correct?
Yes, we are not second-guessing the substantive judgments of CMAL in that procurement process.
Definitely down to CMAL,
So
so
CMAL
I
is
can
the procuring
interrogate them when
authority.
they come back to us. Yes. Right, thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you for bottoming that out. Richard, yours is the next
Again, it
question.
comes back to my comment earlier. You say you want a ferry, but you get somebody else to go and buy it for you. And I'll park that for a minute. Right, Chris, your unit, of which your head is the Transport Scotland Ferries unit, yes?
Correct.
You are a civil servant, yes?
Indeed.
Right, so might not have been you, you say your predecessor, made a submission to the Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure Investment Cities on 20th of August 2015, recommending Ferguson be awarded the contract to build the 2 ferries. They confirmed that tenders were assessed on a 50-50 quality ratio. They confirmed that Ferguson submitted the highest cost, but the highest quality bid. It was said CFL raised concerns about the ability of the proposed vessels to access ports, and said that LNG brings some logistic challenges. But, you know, that really confused me, because the panel earlier said that they wanted dual fuel. So we're getting a bit of he said, she said. But here, and I'm going to ask this one before anybody else does. As with procurement, a legal challenge from what your official said, the guy before you or the lady before you, sorry, that said a legal challenge for one of the unsuccessful shipyards cannot be discounted. CMAL have not identified any particular risks in any case, are confident any challenge can be defended. But here's the rub, and I want to know why someone, an official, would say this. That said, the relationship between Scottish ministers and Ferguson's owner is well known. Why would any official say that? Tell me.
So it would be standard practice in all of our submissions to ministers around these things to reflect any risk.
Sorry, can you add? Maybe my hearing's going. I can't hear you too well.
Sorry, I would say it's our standard practice in any submission to ministers around these types of issues to flag up any potential risk of challenge. As we've set out in there, we felt that risk of challenge was low. In addition, we set out that point around the fact that there was indeed that public perception or known perception of a relationship. I think the second part of that paragraph also highlights, though, that we didn't think that was likely to lead to more risk of a successful challenge.
Is that usual to say that in a letter?
I think we would usually highlight anything that is likely to heighten a risk of a challenge, no matter how low we felt the likelihood was of a successful challenge. In that case, it was merely indicating a potential additional factor there that might have brought a challenge.
The risk here is a presentational risk and one of the perception of a conflict of interest. And I am quite clear in my own mind that there was no conflict of interest in relation to this procurement and that it was undertaken in an open and impartial manner.
Well, I also am quite clear there was no risk and there was no perception of that you know, everybody was palsy-walsy, right? But it annoys me when you see that in a letter. So, what, you know, is that usual to say that? You know, you do contracts more than I do. So, has that been said before?
So yes,
you know,
yes, it would be usual to highlight any presentational risk to ministers.
So it's a standard, right? That's what I wanted you to say. It's a standard situation. Here you go, we're awarding a contract to Joe Bloggs, but you know, we might have met Joe Bloggs at a conference, or we might have met Joe Bloggs at this, that, or the other, but there's no impropriety. So the suggestion, let me finish. So the suggestion that there was impropriety, you totally refute.
Entirely.
Thank you.
And the next question then comes from Rachel. Rachel.
Thank you. There were two loans, commercial loans, one in 2017, 15 million, and the other of 30 million in 2018. What was the purpose of those commercial loans?
So, I guess in the first instances, those loans didn't come from Transport Scotland. That was another part of Scottish Government, Department of Economic Development colleagues that led on that side of things. My understanding, this information is in the public domain, and I think it's also in the narrative and some of the material that we released, was that the loans were around cash flow, and then also cash flow and diversification of the business.
Okay. Just to get a picture of why those loans were necessary, were there delays in the project and that necessitated a loan? Were you aware that what the loans were secured for? I understand that you were telling me it was the Scottish Government that dealt with those loans, but were you aware of what those loans were actually requested for? Were they requested initially for modernising the yard, or they were requested because the project had been knocked off and subsequently subcontractors left and there wasn't the expertise, and so the whole project slipped?
So we were not cited on the request or the discussions between Ferguson's and Scottish Government in relation to the reasons for the loan, nor were we cited on the diligence that was undertaken in relation to that. So without wishing to sound evasive, I'm unable to answer any questions on the detail. And that was quite deliberate, again, to avoid any perception or potential conflict of interest in terms of our role as CMAL's sponsor, so CMAL being the client, and Ferguson's interest as the contractor and the vessel, the contracts for 801 and 802.
However, am I not right in saying that you directed conversations on behalf of the Scottish Government to ease the pressure on the timetable, and that timetable then slipped?
Yes, we did. So we convened, we sought to bring the parties together to encourage discussion around progress on the vessels, yes.
And who did you bring in to have those conversations?
So those were not undertaken solely by Transport Scotland. We spoke regularly with CMAL, both independently. There were discussions with the management team at Ferguson's. We brought them together to have those on a conjoined basis, both at official level and with ministers.
Okay.
Rachel, that's probably as far as I can let you.
The state aid rules, would you like me to ask that?
Sorry?
Would you like me to ask questions about the state aid
Well,
rules?
you've done a series of questions. I may have to move on just to allow other members to come in, I'm afraid. So, Emma, I would encourage you to brevity, I think, with your ones. You've got two questions.
I think, oh yes, okay. I'll be very quick actually. So, Transport Scotland approached Luke Van Beek to conduct a gateway review in the project, which didn't happen. Can you tell us why a review wasn't carried out?
Yes, I'll give you an answer for that one. Was that we did, following an engagement, I think it was in November 2017, have the Transport Minister at the time, Mr Yousaf, met with FML and CMAL, and at that point in time he agreed that we would undertake a peer review, which I think was the language we used, although gateway review may have kind of entered some of the parlance and the exchanges on this. We then, in Transport Scotland, sought to identify someone through various government frameworks that could undertake that peer review, looking at the programme going forward, what the potential delays had been, how these could be recovered. We identified, and I understand at the time we interviewed a number of potential candidates from that framework and identified Commodore Van Beek. However, the passage of time at that point had been taken us to the point where the discussions were around the loans that Ms Hamilton was asking around there. And there was a pressing need for someone to engage with economic development colleagues in relation to the loan certifications and drawdown in that space. So at that point in time, the decision was taken that was the more pressing need, and Commodore Van Beek was engaged by economic development to do that work. But effectively, things had moved on in that time period.
Okay. Luke Van Beek also highlighted in his reports that a limited cash flow was affecting the ability for Ferguson Marine to build the new ferries. Was there any action that Transport Scotland took place to help alleviate that, which he highlighted in his report?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure exactly at that point in time, but it certainly, as Fran referred to earlier, we engaged with CMAL around the payments and flexibilities in terms of the contractual payments, and also in the kind of wider space of being a responsible client and other things they could do, seek assurances around no changes to the vessel and the various other specifications and design and the various other issues that were being raised at the time.
So specifically on cash flow, yes, we did engage around May or June 2017, and at that point we asked CMAL to look at what flexibility it had in relation to the payment milestones to alleviate some of Ferguson's cash flow issues. There was a revision to some of the payment milestones where final delivery payments were reduced from around 25% to about 20 to 10%, and that was to allow some payments to be brought forward in accordance with an accelerated delivery programme, and that was closely monitored. And again, the details of that have been proactively published on the website.
Okay, thanks.
Colin, you want to come briefly, one question.
On the issue of a peer review and a gateway review, briefly, what was the difference between the two, and is the peer review that was carried out more comprehensive than the gateway review that was recommended?
So there was no recommendation for a gateway review. The genesis of the language gateway review was loose language when we were engaging within our framework documents to identify appropriate candidates. The peer review that was agreed or requested by ministers in 2017 related to the programme milestones. And when Commodore Van Beek was engaged, he was engaged with quite a narrow remit in relation to the voted loans. And again, that was looking at performance against the programme delivery milestones by Ferguson's. We didn't undertake a gateway review. That's a distinct project management standard.
Why not?
Because we are not the procuring authority. So if there were to be a gateway review, that would be undertaken by the procuring authority itself.
But they didn't do that, though. They didn't carry that out.
Not that I'm aware of CMAL doing one, but Transport Scotland certainly didn't commission that on its behalf.
And just for clarity, Luke Van Beek was engaged in relation to the commercial loans.
Peter, you've got a quick question.
Yeah. Luke Van Beek stated that arbitration was the most cost-effective way to deliver the ferries and secure the future of the Ferguson Marine Shipyard. Do you agree with this view?
No, I mean, I think we we didn't agree with the view at the time, and we also, as things have been borne out, I'm not of the view that that would have resolved the difficulties that we have in terms of the quantum of work that's still to be done. Clearly that arbitration would have led to some level, or potentially led to some level of settlement. There was also the option of a claim that could have been brought forward by FML and tested in the courts, which didn't happen. And indeed, CMAL have refuted that claim in full as well. And again, I'm sure they'll speak to that in detail when they meet with you next week. What we did do, though, was look at all of the other potential options we had to resolve this issue going forward. So in January or February 2019, when it was becoming evident that the cash flow issues were coming to a head, or likely to come to a head, and in the absence of that CPI claim being brought forward, we engaged with PwC and legal advisors to look at a wide range of options that could have given us a potential way forward to save the jobs, deliver the vessels, protect the business. And that was quite a wide-ranging piece of work that had they had a pretty free remit to look at any option that could be considered. They kind of started with a long list of, I think, 29 options that they then tested against those criteria, but also against the range of procurement and state aid tests that we would have to satisfy. And effectively, in the absence of that CPI claim or some other commercial agreement or injection of cash from some other area, then effectively that led us down to the three issues or potential options that we end up with, which were to either build out, retender the vessels effectively with the potential that the business would win that business, to, had the business gone into administration, to work with the administrator to complete the vessels. And then the third option was the public ownership option. And those were the kind of, I'm conscious that was in relation to the arbitration and Luke Van Beek advice, but just to assure you that there was wider advice being considered around all of the options to resolve this dispute.
Okay. I'm afraid we are going to have to move on because we are short of time, and I'd like to get at least three other members in. Angus, briefly.
Okay, thanks, Convener. Richard Lyle helpfully touched on future ferry procurement earlier. However, I'd like to expand on it a wee bit further. The committee's heard evidence from several stakeholders that a radically different approach to vessel replacement and deployment is needed. So, how do you intend to incorporate these views, also incorporate the findings of this inquiry and the wider concerns raised by island communities into the revised versions of the Vessel Replacement and Deployment Plan and the Scottish Ferries Plan?
So I have closely followed, of course, the evidence of this inquiry, and I've listened with interest to some of the recommendations that have been put forward. The ferries plan at the time that it was introduced was actually quite a radical thing, or intended to be quite a radical thing, which set out those outcomes, and the VRDP following from that setting out a longer term investment strategy. I accept the feedback and I agree with the feedback that that could go further. For me, I'm quite keen that the next iteration of the ferries plan, which we're developing now, takes a more holistic approach and actually thinks about island connectivity in the round rather than thinking about ferries on a mode specific basis. And that has to look at how we are best serving communities and thinking about the demand that's there and what that connectivity can deliver, as opposed to just being an end in itself. That will require a lot of engagement. I am mindful of the feedback around stakeholder fatigue. What I have taken away from that is actually, I think that Transport Scotland is pretty good, and that the ferries unit is pretty good at speaking to people and listening to people. Where we could undoubtedly improve is articulating how we have understood what we've heard and reflecting that back to people, and perhaps being clearer in how we reach balanced decisions. In terms of the radical approaches that we've heard, I'm absolutely receptive to constructive challenge around that. I am absolutely receptive to getting people's feedback. The points that have been raised are arguably fairly well rehearsed points, and Mr Drummond in his evidence described that as being an exercise in prioritisation and balancing competing interests. So the idea of standardisation of vessels, for example, is not new. That's one that ministers are working towards already. These two vessels were intended to be, or are intended to be, interoperable to provide resilience across 15 routes, for example. That will need infrastructure upgrades to our port and harbours, but we are in the invidious position of not having a blank sheet of paper. We don't have the luxury of interoperability at the moment. We have to deliver that in a phased manner, but absolutely committed to doing that. Balancing that against other demands for one vessel versus two vessels. So there is a huge amount of evidence-based analysis that informs decisions around whether it's one vessel or two. And I'm happy to provide as much information on that as you may or may not wish to receive. But I accept in that the challenge for us is articulating where there's a balance between the needs of an individual community versus the interoperability and resilience and standardisation across the network as a whole. We need to get better at articulating that. So sorry to bring that to a close and briefly say, yes, we will reflect very much on the findings and the evidence that's been given to this inquiry.
Okay, that's certainly good to hear, and we look forward to progress on that. But I've got one specific point, Convener. We've heard in evidence that an Australian shipbuilder has approached Ferguson's with a view to building Australian-designed ships, but under licence in Port Glasgow. Is it possible for you to give us any insight into why these approaches, I believe, were rejected, given presumably they approached Transport Scotland as well?
So I'm not cited on any specific approaches to Ferguson's. I'm afraid I'm unable to answer that. I am aware that Transport Scotland was contacted by an Australian company with an interest in developing catamarans, and Transport Scotland referred that inquiry to CMAL as the procuring authority. Okay. I don't have a closed mind to what technology we deploy here, but the technology has to work. We have looked at catamarans in general and on a route-specific basis, and there are challenges on the West Coast in particular around those not being suitable, but we don't have a closed mind to what the technology should be.
They could well be suitable on the shorter routes, but it's an issue for CMAL. Finally, can I ask you, given that the Ferguson's Yard is now in the ownership of the Scottish Government, how is that going to impact on future procurement of new vessels?
Yeah, so I think we've alluded to earlier that the Ferguson Marine Directorate has been set up within Scottish Government to help support Ferguson in public ownership, and that team, along with the business, is looking at its future structure, and clearly having a pipeline of work is going to be important for the business. That work is a work in progress and is going to take some time, but from a Transport Scotland perspective, back to our earlier points and CalMac's points around needing to get vessels in service as quick as we can and as efficiently as we can, that's going to form the focus of our strategy going forward. So in an immediate term, we're still going to have to tender for vessels. So the next vessel the next vessel we go for is likely to go out to the open market for tender.
Okay, thank you.
And I have warned both Dean and Stuart that it will be a very brief question. I'm sorry, time is pressing. Dean, do you want to start as Stuart started last time?
Thank you, Convener. You said earlier that during the course of the contract you had flagged various concerns to ministers about how it was progressing. What ministers were made aware of these concerns during the course of the contract?
I will struggle to provide a comprehensive answer to that. I'll need to look back just to double check. Certainly at the time, submissions would routinely go to the then Transport and Island Minister, Mr Yousaf. I'm aware that Mr Mackay would also have been aware in his capacity as CabSec for Cities and Investment at the time. I would need to double check that.
A suggestion in the sense that I've read the papers that you've published and looked at them quite carefully. It is extremely difficult to see reports to ministers in there because a lot of it is darkened out and it is difficult to see. So if you were able to give a list of dates that you reported to the ministers on concerns, that would be extremely helpful to the committee.
Happy to do that.
Does that answer your question, Dean?
That's fine, yes, thank you.
Stuart.
Thank you, Convener. Excuse me. Mike Rumbles has asked a number of questions earlier regarding price and the Ferguson's tender price that they put in. And we're aware that the process was a 50-50 split between quality and also price. But I think, as we're all aware, and I'm sure you'll probably agree to this, that Audit Scotland's recommendations when it comes to tenders are the issue of best value. So it's not always about the cheapest is the best. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that, yes.
And you're aware that certainly in the past that Ferguson's actually had lost out on some contracts, particularly 2005, the Scottish Fishery Protection Vessel, which Ferguson's tender was more expensive, but the then Scottish Executive took the decision to award the contract to Rementoa because it was the cheapest.
I am aware of that, yes.
Okay, thank you.
And I've one final question, just for clarity on something. There were 15 stage payments for each of the ferries. I'm told that stage payments for ships usually come in 5. Was there a reason why you went for 15? Were you concerned about cash flow payments, or do you think they were concerned about cash flow payments, which is why they made 15 payments, or proposing 15 payments rather than 5?
So, again, in the interest of clarity, we didn't go for 15. It would have been CMAL who set those payment milestones.
But would you have been concerned?
No, I wasn't at that point, because there's a balance in all of this. You can structure those payments in whichever manner you think provides the appropriate balance of cash flow and risk, and that would have been a judgment for CMAL.
I absolutely understand that, and if I as a businessman was ordering something and I was worried there was a higher risk, I would have reduced the payments. I would have made them much more sequential, i.e. 15 rather than 5. And I'm just asking if that did that feature in your thought process on it, or did you just think it was okay?
We did address our minds to it. Didn't cause us particular alarm. I think the correct balance that was in there, and alongside the milestone payments, there were security provisions in place in relation to taking title, CMAL taking title or title vesting in CMAL at various points. So the appropriate mechanisms were in place to counteract that increased frequency of milestone. Okay,
thank you. And we've rather exceeded our time, for which I apologise, but thank you very much for the evidence that you've given. It's been extremely detailed, and there are 1 or 2 issues which you've agreed to come back to the committee on, and we look forward to receiving those as soon as possible, because we have another evidence session next week. So I'm now going to suspend the meeting. I would ask committee members to stay in place, if possible. I would ask everyone else to leave as quietly as possible so that we can then go into private session. So the meeting is suspended.